Hey everyone, welcome back to the Majesty of Reason. I'm Joe Schmid, and today we're joined by Dr. Justin Mooney to give a mostly comprehensive survey of the literature on the problem of evil. Justin is an assistant professor of philosophy at the College of the Holy Cross. He specializes in metaphysics and the philosophy of religion, with a special focus on the problem of evil within the philosophy of religion. And in fact, he even maintains an extensive bibliography of work on the problem of evil. So, Justin, thanks for joining me. And maybe you can say a bit more about that bibliography for our audience.
Yeah, great. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here, and I'm really excited to do kind of an in-depth overview of work on the problem of evil, because it's just such a, I mean, it's obviously a topic of wide interest, but also it's a very complex topic, and there's a lot to explore. Yeah, so about the bibliography. So I can't remember, I don't know, it was a few years ago. I spent like a summer going through like the archives of a bunch of journals and just putting together a huge bibliography of work on the problem of evil that's organized by like the topics and subtopics within that literature. And then I made it publicly available. So right now there's a link to it on my website, but it's a little bit hard to find. It's so I think I need to make it easier to get to. But anyway,
I'll link to it in the description for the audience.
Oh, perfect. Yeah. So anyway, I think a number of people working in the problem of evil have found this useful. I've found it useful myself. Just because it's kind of like if you're thinking about a specific question that has to do with the problem of evil, it's sort of a quick way to find like everything that's been written about that specific question in that topic, right? I mean, and I say everything, that's an exaggeration. It's the biography or bibliography is not exhaustive. In particular, when works on the problem of evil are published in journals that are either like not in the top 10 to 15 journals or not in well-known specialist philosophy of religion journals, those are journals where I didn't go through their archives. And so those papers I kind of find, every once in a while I stumble across another one and I add it. So anyway, it's not an exhaustive bibliography, but I'm trying to get it as close to that as I can.
Justin made a wonderful presentation for us. So we all, everyone type thank you, Justin, in the comment section.
Okay, so the problem of evil, I've subtitled the presentation A Survey of the Literature, but I need to qualify that a bit. There's a particular literature that I'm going to be focusing on, and it is not the full body of literature on the problem of evil, because that is just vast and like multidisciplinary. What I'm going to be doing is focusing on primarily the literature on the problem of evil in the analytic philosophical tradition, which is a relatively young European philosophical tradition. And I'm focusing on that body of literature because that is where my expertise is. I don't think anybody is an expert on like all the bodies of literature on the problem of evil, and certainly I'm not. So I'm just going to focus on what I know. So with that qualification in place, what I want to do here is try to give an overview of like at least the main topics of conversation in this specific literature. But let's start with a very fundamental question. What is the problem of evil? And I think usually it's very, very hard to define any interesting concepts in philosophy. And certainly defining the problem of evil is not an exception, but I actually think that the following definition is pretty good. I think of the problem of evil as a tension between facts about the occurrence of bad things, so like suffering and wrongdoing would be primary examples, on the one hand, and then theism on the other hand, where theism, at least in the analytic literature on this topic, is normally defined narrowly to be the view that there is an omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly good being, or something like that, right? A being with those attributes that created the world, or whatever. You might add a couple of other things. We will talk a little bit later in this presentation about like what happens if you drop the assumption that God has all of those properties. But for now, we're thinking about God in that way. So the way I have defined this is extremely broad, right? The notion of attention is a broad notion. And that's deliberate because I think it works to capture a lot of different aspects of the problem. So a number of people have noted that the problem of evil has both theoretical and practical dimensions. And though both of those are a kind of tension, right? Because tensions can be theoretical, they can also be practical, right? Now, the analytic literature on the problem of evil focuses primarily on the theoretical side. And so for that reason, this presentation will also focus primarily on the theoretical side. Another distinction that's important and that some people have drawn is you can distinguish between the problem of evil as an internal problem for the theist or as an external problem. So Marilyn Adams draws a distinction like this. William Lane Craig draws a distinction like this. And the idea is that, look, if you're thinking about the problem of evil from the point of view of a theist, you can think of it as just sort of like an internal problem for your set of beliefs. You can think of it as like, look, I believe on the one hand that there's suffering and bad things in the world. On the other hand, I believe that there's a God that has these certain attributes. And there's a problem about like, well, how do these two things that I believe in fit together? On the other hand, you can think about it externally, and you can do this either as a theist or as a non-theist. But you can think about the problem externally as like, okay, well, there are these facts that we know about bad stuff in the world, and there's a question as to whether those facts are evidence against theism, and if so, to what extent, like how much evidence and what kind, in what way are they evidence against theism, and things like that, right? And so again, the analytic literature on this topic has mostly kind of taken an external approach to the problem. And that's because a lot of the work on the problem of evil is a dialogue between theists and non-theists. And so that will also be reflected in this presentation.
I just want to add here maybe that the internal-external dichotomy might not be a fully black and white dichotomy. We might think that you could get like a sort of partly internal critique, partly external critique or something like that. Like we might run an argument from evil. Let's say I'm an anti-realist. In particular, let's say I'm an error theorist. So I think that moral judgments, moral statements, they do express propositions. They can be, they're truth apt, so they have a truth value. But nevertheless, all of them are just systematically false. So it's not the case that murder is wrong. It's not the case that, suffering is morally bad, etc. Even still, I might be able to run a partly internal critique of theists, their theistic view by arguing that, hey, I do grant the existence of suffering in the world. And here's the partly internal critique. By the theist's lights, that suffering is morally bad because the theist is, typically committed to some kind of realism, etc. So by the theist's lights, that's bad. And then I can go on to mount other external components that maybe the theist doesn't grant, but that I say have really good reasons in support of them and which are compatible with my error theory. Notice that what I've done here is at least it's partly internal because, I myself don't grant that the relevant suffering is morally bad. So I'm saying, hey, at least by your lights, by the theist's lights, if theism is true, or if your brand of theism is true, then this suffering around us is morally bad. But it's also partly external because maybe the theist and their internal views reject the other claims I'm appending onto my argument. But maybe I can marshal independent good reasons for those other claims and such that those other claims don't commit me as an error theorist to moral judgments being true. So I just wanted to say, maybe for the audience, be aware of partly internal and partly external critiques.
Yeah, sure. Or maybe another way of looking at it, it might be that there's two different ways of distinguishing between internal and external, the two different distinctions, right? So I was kind of thinking primarily in terms of perspective. Are you viewing this from the perspective of a theist who has these commitments and wants to know, okay, how do they fit together? I'm not questioning either of them, but I want to know how they fit together. Or are you looking at it from the perspective of someone who's not a theist, who is raising a question about at least one of the relevant commitments and saying, the one is evidence against the other? And then there's this other way of drawing the internal-external distinction that's less to do with perspective and more to do with whether the premises you use are premises that you, the non-theist, accept, or only premises that you're at least counting on the theist to accept?
Right.
I don't know if that made sense.
No, that does make sense. That's good. I just wanted the audience to be aware of some of the dialectical intricacies here.
Sure. When you look at the literature, the analytic literature on the problem of evil, I think that the vast majority of it can be sorted into 4 categories. And here they are. So the first category is arguments from evil, like specific arguments from evil. You've got a lot of work that's trying to develop different kinds of arguments from evil, defend those arguments, or critique those arguments. And then there's a bunch of literature on theodicies and defenses, which are basically hypotheses about why God permits evil and suffering. We'll get to that later. And so there's a bunch of literature attempting to develop like specific theodicies and defenses, or defend them or critique them. And then there's this is my term. This is not really a term that I've seen in the literature as far as I know, but there are what you could call epistemic defenses, which are strategies that are attempting to block arguments from evil, but that don't necessarily rely on supplying some kind of hypothesis about why God permits evil. And so skeptical theism is the best known of those. So we'll talk about that. And then finally, Meta-Theodicy, which is like, instead of engaging it with specific theodicies, either like developing and defending them or trying to critique them or whatever, Meta-Theodicy asks second order questions about theodicy. Like, okay, well, what are the conditions that a theodicy would have to satisfy in order to be successful? And is the project of trying to develop a theodicy even a project that we should be trying to engage in at all? Okay, so most of the work in the analytic literature, I think, falls into these categories. And so I've organized the presentation around these 4 categories. So I want to just kind of like walk through each of them one at a time. So the first one then is arguments from evil. All right, so there are lots and lots and lots and lots of arguments from evil that have been developed by philosophers, and you can divide them up into different kinds in multiple ways. One way of dividing them up into different kinds is based on the kind of inference that does the heavy lifting in the argument. And so I want to first kind of distinguish arguments from evil in that way, because this is an influential way of categorizing them. And here, the very first distinction to draw, and is also the best known distinction between kinds of argument from evil, and it's the distinction between what are called logical arguments from evil on the one hand, and what are called evidential arguments from evil on the other hand. Now, actually, I think that this distinction is very difficult to draw. I'm not even entirely happy with the definitions that I'm about to give you, but I think that they're pretty good. They're loosely based on the way Daniel Howard Snyder divides these 2 kinds of arguments from evil. So here's a stab, anyway, at defining logical argument from evil. A logical argument from evil is a claim, logical arguments from evil claim that relatively uncontroversial empirical facts about evil, conjoined with necessary truths, entail atheism. Okay, so the idea is you take some facts about evil that we can just sort of observe, that like this is sort of thing that happens in the world and nobody's really challenging that these kinds of evils or these facts about evil obtain. And then the thought is, taking just those kinds of facts about evil, we can get to atheism using necessary truths that are known like a priori. So that's kind of the thought here. Now, one thing to notice is I have not defined a logical argument from evil as just like any deductive argument from evil. I sometimes see people talking about the distinction this way, like, oh, well, logical arguments from evil are deductive, evidential arguments from evil are inductive, but that's not correct for multiple reasons, the most important of which is that evidential arguments from evil can be formulated deductively. And in fact, William Rowe, in his 1979 paper that kind of sort of launched the contemporary discussion of evidential arguments from evil, if I remember correctly, he actually formulates his evidential argument deductively in that paper. So the deductive, inductive inference division is not the way to do it. I mean, it has something to do with the distinction, right? What makes Rowe's argument evidential is that one of the premises relies for its justification on a really important inductive inference. But it's too simple to just say, oh, well, if it's deductive, then it's logical. And if it's inductive, right.
And one reason for that also is like Bayesian arguments are, technically speaking, deductive. I mean, like you've got one premise which says the likelihood of some piece of evidence on a hypothesis, another premise which says the likelihood of the relevant evidence given the alternative hypothesis, and then maybe some other premise. And then from those, it like deductively follows, like from Bayes' theorem, that the piece of evidence, the piece of data favors one hypothesis over another. And we wouldn't really want to say that Bayesian arguments from evil are logical arguments from evil.
Right. So. In fact, at any rate, that's not what anyone seems to say about them. Right. So, I mean, maybe this is a good point to clarify. What I'm doing here, the way I'm trying to define logical argument from evil, I'm trying to capture the way the term is used in the literature. And so, although it is not often defined carefully, when you look at the kinds of arguments that people in the literature classify as logical arguments from evil, something like this seems to be what they have in mind. And this is important for the next point here, which is the Epicurean argument from evil, which we'll look at in just a second. Sometimes I've seen people confuse the Epicurean argument from evil with the logical argument from evil, basically equating the two, saying, well, this just is the logical argument from evil, this argument that is attributed to the philosopher Epicurus. And that's a mistake, at least given the way the term logical argument from evil is used in the literature. The Epicurean argument from evil is an example of a logical argument from evil, but there are many other examples of such arguments as well. And I've listed here some names of people who have defended logical arguments from evil. So J.L. Mackie is famous for kind of extending and updating the Epicurean argument, or at any rate, giving it a detailed defense. And then these other names here, Schellenberg, Sturba, Monaghan, have all developed logical arguments from evil that are importantly different from the Epicurean / Mackie kind of argument. And there are others as well. This isn't an exhaustive list. If you look at that bibliography we were talking about, you can find even more. But anyway, so there's a range of different arguments from evil in the literature that people classify generally as logical arguments from evil. Here's an example then of a logical argument from evil, and I'm going to use the Epicurean one that I was just mentioning. I choose this one because it is kind of like the original gangster argument from evil. When you look at like the history of arguments from evil, this is sort of like the earliest case, or at least the most famous of the earliest cases, where you have something like an actual argument being formulated that would qualify as an argument from evil. I'm going to give you a version of it that's indebted to Mackie, though I don't think it's quite the same as the way even Mackie formulated it. Certainly not the way the Epicurus formulated it. But anyway, here we go. So premise 1, if God exists, then God is omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly good. Premise 2, if God is omnipotent and omniscient, then God can prevent every evil. Premise 3, if God is perfectly good, then God prevents every evil God can. So, if God exists, then there is no evil. But there is evil. So, God does not exist. Okay, so relatively straightforward argument in some sense. And you can see that it's a logical argument from evil by looking at, so what facts about evil does it rely on? Well, that's premise 5, right? There is evil. And that is a relatively uncontroversial empirical fact about evil. So it's using the kinds of facts about evil that logical arguments from evil use. And then the other premises, 1, 2, and 3, certainly 2 and 3 Mackie presents as being like conceptual necessities, right? So these are necessary truths, or at least they're supposed to be, or claimed to be, right? I don't remember what he says about 1. I do remember, though, that Epicurus, in the version of the argument that's at least often attributed to him, says something like, look, if God isn't all powerful and perfectly good, then why call him God? And that maybe suggests that Epicurus was thinking of premise 1 as something like a conceptually necessary truth as well. Alternatively, you could just offer premise 1 as a stipulation, right? You could just say, look, this is the kind of God that I'm interested in, so I'm going to stipulate that when I use the word God, I mean this kind of God, right? Okay, so This is a version of the logical argument from evil, the Epicurean argument. It's also importantly, I think it's fair to say at this point that this is an outdated argument from evil. It had an important role to play in the history of philosophy, but so far as I know, none of the relevant experts really defend this argument anymore. And I also think that something general can be said about why. For the most part, the problem, people view premise 3 as being kind of the weak link. If God is perfectly good, then God prevents every evil God can. In general, people seem to sort of concede that, well, look, it could at least be true in principle that maybe God has some good reason for permitting evil. And for that reason, premise 3 is at best sort of suspicious. And most of the work now in the literature on the problem of evil is kind of focusing on that possibility in one way or another, right? Trying to identify good reasons God might have for permitting evil or not preventing it, or trying to argue that we have no good basis for at least ruling out this possibility that God has these reasons, that sort of a thing. For the most part, then, the Epicurean argument is kind of outdated, but it is a nice example of a logical argument from evil. Do you have any thoughts about this, Joe?
No, that all seems fair. I mean, I just want the audience to know that there are lots of other versions, as you said, but I just want to emphasize it. There are lots of other versions of the logical argument from evil, many of which have been defended, or maybe I shouldn't say many, some of which have been defended within even the last 5 years, like James Sturba, J.L. Schellenberg. So there's still active debate about some versions of the logical argument from evil. It's not like all of them are kind of dead, like as you sort of mentioned, the Epicurean one is dead.
Yes, and basically the difference is, they differ from the Epicurean one intended in two ways. One is, instead of just taking the bare fact that there is evil, they tend to take more detailed facts about what kinds of evil there is, and how much there is, stuff like that, right? And yet they try to stick to relatively uncontroversial empirical facts. And then the other thing they do differently is, instead of trying to use this simple premise 3, if God's perfectly good, then God prevents every evil God can, they try to find more complex, allegedly necessary truths about the connection between God's perfect goodness and what sorts of things, God would necessarily do. So anyway, good. So let's look at evidential arguments from evil. In contrast to logical arguments, here's my best attempt, at least for the time being, at defining an evidential argument from evil. These are arguments which claim that empirical facts about evil that do not themselves entail atheism supply inductive or abductive evidence for propositions about evil that do entail atheism. All right, so the idea is you start with some facts about evil. Again, you try to stick with relatively uncontroversial facts that are sort of known empirically. Now, it's not entirely clear how to specify exactly what I'm trying to say with that, because what do we mean by empirical, right? Okay, it's not the case that you have to have observed the evil yourself, right? It might be something that you read about or somebody told you about. It could even be like I can make it a trivial inductive inference right now that there's lots of suffering going on in the world as we speak. And that's the sort of fact that could be used in a logical argument from evil. It would qualify as what I mean by an empirical fact. But anyway, so it's a little bit difficult to draw that line. But anyway, the thought is you start with some facts about evil that, for the most part, nobody's going to dispute. And then you say, look, we can get from those facts to a fact like, oh, this evil is totally pointless, there's no good reason why God would permit it, something like that, by way of a non-deductive inference of some sort. Okay, so again, many different kinds of evidential arguments from evil are out there. I've listed here a bunch of different people who have defended evidential arguments from evil, and I think that on this list, each of these names represents not just someone who defended an evidential argument from evil, but someone who's defended a version of that argument that's importantly different from the other versions that are out there in some way. So most of these are contemporary philosophers, but I also included Hume, who's kind of like the dude who originated evidential arguments from evil. Okay, there's a so there are further distinctions you can draw then between kinds of evidential argument from evil, and there's not really any like one way of doing this that's standard in the literature. But here's one way of doing it that I think is not, not idiosyncratic at least. So you can distinguish inductive arguments from evil and abductive arguments from evil. I'm using inductive here in a really narrow sense to just talk about basically inductive generalizations from samples to populations. So the idea is like, look, if every raven I've seen is black, other things being equal, it seems reasonable for me to inductively generalize from those observations to this general fact that, well, all ravens are black. So that's an inductive generalization. And so inductive arguments from evil in the narrow sense that I have in mind here, they rest on inductive generalizations from empirical facts about evil. And then there are abductive arguments from evil, which rest on abductive inferences from empirical facts about evil. And so abductive inferences are like inferences to the best explanation, or the kinds of inferences that can contribute to an inference to the best explanation. So like Swinburne distinguishes between C inductive and P inductive arguments, and those are both abductive in the sense that I mean here anyway. And they can be both formal or informal. So you can use like a formal apparatus like Bayesian apparatus to run these sorts of arguments. Or you could do something more informal, like give an informal characterization of certain theoretical virtues like explanatory power and simplicity, and then try to argue that that some kind of atheistic conclusion, or at least some kind of pro-atheistic sort of conclusion, is the best explanation of certain facts about evil. Okay, so let's look at an example of each of these. Here's an inductive argument from evil, again, in that narrow sense. It's a version of Rowe's original inductive argument. So I mentioned earlier, Rowe published this paper in 1979. It was called The Problem of Evil and Some Varieties of Atheism. And it basically initiated the whole contemporary literature on evidential arguments from evil. And in that paper, he defends an argument that goes something like the following. This is not the way he framed or presented it. This is my presentation of it, but it captures the main move that he's making. So first, premise one, no reasons we can think of are good reasons for God to permit child torture. So actually, you can basically plug in any evil here where it's difficult to think of a plausible reason why God would let that happen. The example Rowe used was of a fawn that was badly burned in a forest fire and kind of like laid in agony for, I think it was like 5 days or something before it died. That was his example. And he's definitely being very strategic, right? He's picking a case of animal suffering that's isolated from human beings to try to avoid certain kinds of theodicies. I think child torture is also a pretty good example that even the theodicies that are prima facie applicable to it are really not successful defenses of this. So anyway, but you can plug in, take any evil you want, pick one that's just really hard to come up with a good theodicy for, right? All right, so no reasons we can think of are good reasons for God to permit child torture. So no reasons are good reasons for God to permit child torture. So this is already an inference. We've got one premise, and then we've got an inference to an initial conclusion. But the inference here is an inductive generalization. It's supposed to be similar to like if I were to say, no ravens I've seen are green, therefore no ravens are green. Other things being equal, that seems like a pretty good inference. And this is supposed to be similar. Okay, so we've got no reasons are good reasons for God to permit child torture. Now add this premise. If no reasons are good reasons for God to permit child torture, then if there is child torture, then there's no God. There is child torture, obvious empirical fact, so there is no God. All right, so technically to get to that final conclusion, you need to apply modus ponens twice. And I've sort of skipped or left one of the applications implicit, but I think it should be clear enough how the argument is supposed to work. Premise 3, I should have said, is supposed to be motivated by the thought that, look, God is perfectly good. If God is perfectly good, then God isn't going to, let really horrible things happen for no reason. Okay, so this is an example of an inductive argument from evil. and it is an inductive argument because it starts with a relatively uncontroversial empirical fact about evil, and then the key sort of step in the argument, the heavy lifting, is being done by an inductive generalization. And when you look at how people challenge this sort of argument in literature, for the most part, they're either going after premise one or after the inference from premise one to premise two. So if you go after premise one, what that means is you're going to try to tell a plausible story about why God would permit child torture, right? You want to say, no, actually, we can think of a good reason, and here it is. If instead you're going after the inference from premise one to premise two, then what you're going to be doing is trying to argue that, well, yeah, sure, we can't think of a good reason why God would let child torture happen, but that itself is not evidence, or at least not very much evidence, that God has no good reason for this. And so the inference is a weak one. And both of those strategies are things that we'll look at in a great deal of detail later. All right, so here's an abductive argument from evil. Again, I'm going to pick kind of like the most influential one in the analytic tradition. Well, I suppose the most influential is Hume's, but the most influential one by a contemporary author, and that would be Paul Draper's abductive argument from evil. I'm going to give you, again, a version. This is not what I will put here is not how he stated his argument originally, but it's I think, capturing the same idea. And his argument was first published in a 1989 paper called Pain and Pleasure, an Evidential Problem for Theists. And the rough idea of his argument is that when you look at the distribution of pain and pleasure in the world, it seems to be like more what you would expect if something like naturalism is true than if something like theism is true. Okay, so here's one way of stating his argument. So if some fact F is more likely given hypothesis H1 than given hypothesis H2, then F is evidence for H1 over H2. So this is just a general principle about the relationship between conditional probabilities and evidence. And this is actually goes back to something Joe was saying earlier. The fact that I've included this as an explicit premise is going to mean that this argument will be formulated as a deductive argument. But an important part of the work that's being done in this argument is by like a Bayesian inference. And so it is, not a logical argument from evil. Okay, so premise two, the distribution of pain and pleasure is more likely given naturalism than given theism. I should note, I suppose, that Draper in his original paper on this didn't talk about naturalism. He used this hypothesis that he called the hypothesis of indifference. But in his later work, he tends to talk more about naturalism. And I'm just going to follow naturalism here. Okay, and then the thought behind this second premise is, well, think about this, right? So when you look at the way that pain and pleasure are distributed in the world, right? Who experiences pain and in what circumstances? Who experiences pleasure and in what circumstances? It seems like it does not correlate with moral properties very well. It's not as though evil people experience more pain and good people experience more pleasure, for example. On the other hand, it does seem like the distribution of pain and pleasure in the world has a really good biological explanation if you assume that a sort of unguided evolutionary process is responsible for the situations in which we feel pleasure and pain, right? So a lot of it is correlated with whether behaviors are adaptive or not. And then there are cases where normally adaptive pain and pleasure sort of misfires, and you experience it even though it isn't adaptive in a particular case, right? And all of that is the sort of thing you might expect given some things we know about biology. And so the thought is, well, it just seems way more likely, it seems like the probability of pain and pleasure being distributed in this way, given theism, not super high, but it is higher at least given naturalism or something like naturalism. That's the rough idea. And then the conclusion here is the distribution of pain and pleasure is evidence for naturalism over theism. Okay, so again, when you look at how people respond to this argument in the literature, there's kind of two main moves that people make. One is to go after premise 2 and to try to argue that, well, actually, for one reason or another, it's not true that the actual distribution of pain and pleasure in the world is more likely conditional on naturalism than theism, right? You come up with some sort of story about why that is not the case. And then the other strategy is actually just to accept the conclusion, but argue that the conclusion doesn't do much to get us towards atheism, because you'll have noticed, no doubt, the conclusion is not that atheism is true or that God doesn't exist or anything like that. It's just that this fact about pain and pleasure is evidence for naturalism over theism. And that's, of course, something that the theist can accept. They can say, sure, yeah, there are some things in the world that are evidence for naturalism over theism. But then what they will presumably want to say is, but the total evidence doesn't support naturalism over theism. So that's another move that some people make, and we'll talk a little bit more about it later. Okay, so what I just did was I divided arguments from evil, divided them up based on the kind of inference that's doing the heavy lifting in the argument. Here's a totally different way of dividing arguments from evil into different kinds. It's orthogonal to the first way of doing it, but it's another influential way of doing it because it does bring out some salient differences. And that is based on the kinds of empirical facts about evil that are being used in the argument. Okay, so some of these facts are highly general. So for example, there are arguments like the one we just saw that are based on the distribution of facts about suffering or other bad things. In the case of Draper's argument, it wasn't actually suffering, it was pain and pleasure, but similar idea, right? Distribution of suffering. There are arguments that focus on the quantity of suffering in the world. Like, look, there's just so much suffering, right? And this is evidence against the existence of God. There's actually not a whole lot of discussion about the duration of suffering that I have seen, but Peter Van Inwagen has this old paper where I think it's either in the title or the subtitle. He says something like the distribution, quantity, and duration of suffering, or something like that. And he talks about all these different facts about evil and suffering and tries to kind of give a theodicy of them. So you might try to run an argument from the duration of suffering. I suppose that sometimes arguments from evolutionary suffering talk about duration, and so we'll get to that in a second. Severity of suffering. So you can obviously make arguments from the fact that, well, but some evils are just so horrible. And so, for example, one concept that has been really influential in the literature and is due to Marilyn Adams is that of horrendous evil or horrendous suffering. And her characterization of horrendous evil is not purely quantitative, but it does, I think, have a quantitative element to it. I think if I remember right, what she says is a horrendous evil is an evil that's like so bad that it threatens to undermine the very meaningfulness of the sufferer's life, something along those lines. But anyway, so appealing to horrendous evils is at least partly an appeal to like the severity of suffering. And then kinds of suffering, right? Like there are lots of different kinds of suffering, not just kinds of facts about suffering, but kinds of suffering. And so I've got a few of those different kinds listed here as well. To begin with, moral evil versus natural evil. This is probably the most famous distinction in the literature on the problem of evil between different kinds of evil or suffering. And I think that its fame is entirely due to the influence of free will-based approaches to theodicy. And that's because those approaches make this distinction really salient, and other approaches generally don't. But because the distinction is supposed to be at least roughly that moral evil is like bad stuff that's caused by the wrongdoing of human beings or perhaps other moral agents like demons, if there are any such things, right? And then natural evil is supposed to be bad stuff that's caused not by the wrongdoing of moral agents, right? And that's a really salient distinction if you think that free will has an important role to play in explaining the suffering in the world, because it's more obvious how free will helps with moral evil than with natural evil. On the other hand, pretty much any other approach to the problem of evil that doesn't put a lot of emphasis on free will tends not to really highlight this distinction, because it tends not to rely on, it's not restricted, like it's obviously better for moral than for natural evil. So I think this distinction is in some sense, only as important as you think free will is when it comes to theodicy. Another thing to note here is there was a paper a number of years ago that Ted Poston published.
Oh yeah, social evil. Yeah.
Yeah. So he suggested that, hey, there's another kind of evil in addition to moral and natural evil that we haven't been talking about, and he called it social evil. And the thought, if I remember correctly, it has been a long time since I read this paper, but it was something like, well, look, there are cases where everybody in a community can make what seem to be totally reasonable, morally uncriticizable choices. And yet this will result in like a disaster for the community because there weren't enough resources to go around and so forth. And it looks like in this case, you have suffering that's caused by the free actions of moral agents, but not bad actions, not like morally bad or irrational actions or anything of that sort. And so it doesn't really fit neatly into either the moral or natural evil category. Joe, did that sound right to you?
That sounds right. I mean, yeah, they sort of oftentimes arise, social evils, that is, they oftentimes arise through like game theoretic interactions among social agents who are each morally in the clear. They're each sort of like not morally criticizable. But through their sort of collective interactions, they give rise to various bads and evils. So it's not really like caused by the natural world, but it's also not caused by the evil decisions of people. I mean, like one example of this might be like, like stuff about like the tragedy of the commons or something like that. Like each person might very well be doing something entirely permissible and allowing their, let's say, cattle to graze a certain piece of land. But given that everyone sort of does that permissible thing, you can very quickly deplete the land and basically screw over the entire community. And so that would just be an example of evil that results from game theoretic interactions among agents that each of which is doing something entirely permissible and entirely uncriticizable from the moral and arguably rational perspective as well.
Awesome. Yep. Yeah. So anyway, so you might think that there's a third category here between moral and natural evil of social evil. Perfect. Okay. And here's another distinction between kinds of evil that has, again, the importance of these distinctions is usually because one or more theodicies make them salient by working better for evil of the one sort than they do for the other sort. So the distinction between adult and infant suffering is like that as well, because there are a number of popular theodicies that seem to work better for adults than they do for infants. Free will and soul-making theodicies, you might think, both fall into this category. So most of the work on the problem of evil in the analytic literature focuses primarily on the suffering of adults. There is a small body of literature on infant suffering as well, but certainly not much attention, comparatively speaking, has been paid to infant suffering. So anyway, that's another distinction. Another one, this one has been getting more attention recently. I think the engagement with this issue is very much increasing in the literature, and that is human versus animal, or rather non-human animal suffering. So again, for a long time, a lot of the focus was on human suffering, and people just didn't worry too much about animal suffering. There were some things that were said about animal suffering, but sometimes it was kind of dismissive, and there certainly wasn't nearly as much engagement. More and more, though, we've been seeing people take non-human animal suffering seriously and try to kind of explain this from a theistic point of view. What makes it a special challenge is, again, like some of the most popular theodicies, like free will and soul-making theodicies, it's not clear that they work for animal suffering, at least as well as they do for human suffering, right? Now, some people argue that, no, you can extend them to animal suffering, but it's at least not as clear that they can be extended in that way. Okay.
Another one there that we might mention is
Sure.
Dustin Crummett has an interesting paper on insect suffering. And I think we should have less credence that insects suffer than we do for thinking that humans and non-human animals suffer. But there are some empirical considerations and philosophical considerations that should at least allow us to have certainly a non-negligible credence in insect suffering. And that alone can pose particularly, at least a potentially difficult challenge for theists. So people check out Dustin Crummett's paper on this. I might link that in the description as well.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned that, because that is a really good point. So this issue of, a lot of people are willing to grant that at least some animals suffer, like vertebrates or mammals or something like that, right? But yeah, you're right. There's some interesting evidence that perhaps invertebrates like insects, or at least some invertebrates like insects, can suffer as well. And that paper by Dustin is really interesting, and it talks about like how much worse the problem of evil is if, in fact, insects suffer.
Right, and again, we shouldn't just think in binary terms, like, well, we either just believe that they do or we believe that they don't. Like, if we even have, like, let's say a 5% credence in them, like that, if we have a 5% credence that they suffer, and if that makes the problem of evil considerably worse, well, then that itself can do at least some dent to theism's attractiveness and overall probability.
Good. Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah. Okay, excellent. So a related kind of suffering that, again, has been getting increased attention, I would say, in the recent literature is that of evolutionary suffering, right? So there were some developments in the sciences in the, I think, 17th and 18th centuries, right? The discovery of just how old Earth and life on Earth was, I think, 17th century, no, 18th. I think it was an 18th century discovery. And then in the 19th century, you have the development of the theory of evolution. And all of this, some people at any rate argue this makes the problem of evil a lot more challenging as well, because now we know that suffering has been going on much longer than anyone had previously thought. And well, that's probably too strong, but certainly much longer than a lot of people in the like Judeo-Christian tradition seem to have thought, and involving far more individuals, albeit non-human individuals, in most cases when we're talking about evolutionary suffering. So there's a really interesting paper that was published very recently in Faith and Philosophy by someone whose name I'm not sure I know how to correctly pronounce, but it's something like Rope Kajonen. At least I hope I'm remembering correctly who the author is. And he's got this argument that actually evolution doesn't really do anything to make the problem of evil significantly worse. And the thought is something like this, like, all right, well, if it's going to make the problem of evil worse, it's either because it introduces like a new kind of suffering or a new role for suffering, like God using it to create and so forth, or because it just makes there more suffering. And if I remember correctly, what he wants to say is, well, look, evolution is just the natural result of the same kind of suffering that we see going on in the animal world right now. And so all you're really doing is saying, well, that same thing that's happening now, which was already a problem of evil, has been going on for a really long time. Does that really make the problem worse? It seems like the most promising way in which it makes it worse is just by there's a whole lot more suffering. But even that, some people say, well, wait a second. No one experiences more suffering, because what you're doing is just adding more cases of suffering and more individuals experiences these particular cases. But it's not like anybody experiences, this is a point from C.S. Lewis originally, I think. It's not like any one agent experiences all of the evolutionary suffering, right? So it's not worse for anyone in particular in that sense. I hope I'm remembering this paper correctly, but I think that kind of captures the main thrust of the thought. I think that's an interesting paper.
Right. And I mean, just for the audience, like even though, I mean, we can distinguish between like person affecting goodness or like individual affecting goodness and badness, and then just like impersonal goodness or badness, even if, let's say, like no particular individual is like experiencing the sum total of the relevant evils, it still seems impersonally much worse for that to have been going on for like hundreds of millions of years than instead for it to have just been going on for, let's say, a few thousand or something like that.
Sure, yeah.
Because the badness of it all does seem to aggregate in important ways. So just for the audience, I want them to be aware of that sort of.
And that I agree with. I agree with that. Like it does seem, when you just reflecting on it intuitively, there's some important way in which it's worse when there's lots more suffering, even if it's an impersonal way. Yeah. But it does seem like some people want to resist that.
Do you remember what he says in that paper about? Because like one thing that initially struck me when I was initially starting to question my theistic beliefs way back in like 8th grade in high school, was just the fact that God sort of like used this process as his means of creation. Like that always that was always
Oh
very
yeah.
difficult for me. Like this providential being who can choose among an infinite variety of ways to bring about biological diversity in humans, and you chose this one.
Yeah.
It's like the very mechanism of creation is like the suffering and death of innocent creatures. That seemed to me to be poignant when I was really starting to question things. So I wonder if that's also playing in here.
Yeah, I don't remember him talking about that. Well, I guess I'll just say I don't remember whether he does.
Okay.
That because maybe he does. I don't remember it, but it's also a little bit tricky because that thought has a few different components to it, right? So like there's this question of like use and like is God using suffering for certain purposes? And then there's this question of like, well, here are some alternatives. Some of them seem less bad than the actual one. Why didn't God pick the better one? And those are two different issues, I think, that should be disentangled. But
you're right. You're definitely right.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I don't want to get hung up here too long. So let me just one more thing on this list, actual versus possible suffering. So most of the literature focuses on actual suffering. And so the issue is like, well, look at all these actual cases of suffering in the world. This seems like evidence against theism. But there's also a small body of literature on what's called the modal problem of evil. And the thought behind this, the main thought driving this literature is something like this. Theists often say not only that God exists, but that God exists necessarily. And if that's the case, then anything that's incompatible with the existence of God is not just not actual, if theism is true, but is not even possible, like metaphysically possible, if theism is true. And so then what you see people doing is coming up with like creative, imaginary examples of suffering, doctoring them in whatever ways they think are necessary to make them incompatible with theism, and then arguing, but this case of suffering is metaphysically possible. Therefore, theism is at least not necessarily true. No, you could be like a contingent theist like Swinburne, or at least what Swinburne used to be, say, like God exists, but contingently. But you can't be the kind of theist that says that God exists necessarily, because the possibility of these theism incompatible evils rules that out. So anyway, that's the main thing going on.
If I could say something here, I think those are really interesting arguments. I enjoy thinking about them. I think they're really cool. One of them in particular is like, like we can imagine worlds where like space-time reality containing creatures is just like, hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of billions of years of just like pure agony, conscious torture for all the beings involved. And then that goes on throughout like either an endless future or, continues on for hundreds upon billions of years. And then also hundreds of billions of light years across that this happens. Why might we think that that's possible? Well, it seems totally, we just appeal to a lot of our typical modal epistemological tools that we appeal to elsewhere. Like it seems conceivable, seems consistent. We can use recombination or Patrick principles, like we take individual possibilities and we're allowed to duplicate them and rearrange them in ways and then infer that the quote unquote patched together world is possible. There's a really interesting recent paper that develops this called like God's problem of cut and paste by, I think the last name is Gordon. I think that's forthcoming in Faith and Philosophy. So anyway, and I also talk about that with Alex Malpass in one of my articles. So, nice. This is really interesting, and there's some new work on this sort of stuff. So I really like that. So I'll say that. And then one other thing is like I wanted for the audience, I want them to be aware there are also other kinds of evil. So there's like religious evil, like evil that's distinctively caused by religious diversity, or like distinctively caused by religious institutions or things that are like allegedly divinely approved or sanctioned. There's like a problem of divine evil where like God is, according to various scriptures, seems to have done very bad things. There's a teleological evil where the very design plan of certain organisms seems like directed towards inflicting maximum suffering on other creatures, like the wasp, which like stings its prey and then like inserts its larvae into it, which like and keeps it alive, and then like they burrow out of it, etc. So that, like there's teleological evil. There's you mentioned horrendous evil earlier. So like there are lots of different versions of evil, and you can run arguments from evil from a bunch of these different varieties.
Few other arguments from and/or problems of evil I wanted to mention that I thought didn't really fit very neatly into any of the categories we've already looked at. So one is what's called the common sense problem of evil, which claims that there is non-inferential epistemic support for facts about evil that entail atheism. So the thought here is like, well, look, I have evidence that there is a table in front of me right now, but that evidence is not inferential. It's perceptual. Like I have this experience of there seeming to be a table in front of me, and that experience all by itself, without the help of any kind of inference, gives me at least some epistemic justification for believing that in fact there is a table in front of me. And so the thought behind the common sense problem of evil is that we have experiences that similarly non-inferentially motivate propositions that are at least arguably incompatible with theism. So you might like witness a really horrible evil or hear about or read about a really horrible evil and have this experience of like, wow, the awfulness of this, where it just sort of strikes you as like, this is just absolutely gratuitous, or this is just something God wouldn't permit. And then the thought is that that experience itself is evidence for that proposition, which is its content. And so because there's no inference involved, right, it's not really an argument that's being made here. It's just a claim that, well, we have some non-inferential evidence for atheism. Now, the literature on this topic, a lot of it kind of describes itself as sort of tracing from this paper by Doherty from 2008. Though actually there are other people who talking about roughly the same thing prior to Doherty's paper, including, for example, Jerome Gelman. I think back in like either 1990 or 1991, he had a paper anticipating this sort of problem. But anyway, so this is another, it's a problem of evil, not so much an argument from evil, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, if I can add to this one, I don't know, this one has some weight to me. I, like in my mind, like I was watching like documentaries on this very atrocious case. I mean, two sort of things that have happened to me in the last like year. I was watching like a documentary or like a YouTube video on Junko Furuta. It's like this horrible crime where this girl was tortured by these Japanese guys for like I think it was like 30 or 40 days, and the things that they did to her are like unspeakable. Major caution for the audience if you're going to look it up. And I remember like watching that, and I wasn't even like this was just an intuitive reaction. I wasn't even like in the philosophical mode, but like I find myself like having just this intuitive reaction that like anyone with the power and knowledge to stop this must. You know, like I just had that intuitive reaction, like you just can't let this happen. If you have the power and knowledge. And like, you know, some people, like there are testimonial reports about how some people would like go by the house in which it happened and they saw some very suspicious things and they had reason to think, and like the parents also had reason to think, like very good reason to think that very bad things are going on. And like everyone is thinking like the parents, you need to stop this. If you know about it and have the power to do it, you must. And I just had that intuitive reaction in this case. And I was just thinking like, man, like this just, it seems like any being with the power and knowledge to stop this must. It's like you're obliged, it seems. So I had that in that case, but also I think it was during the World War II. I think it again was maybe a Japanese unit where they just did horrible biological experimentation, and I mean like truly grotesque. Yeah, like Unit 737 or something like that. And it was, I had that reaction also in that case. It's like you just get this sense, this intuitive sense that motivates a version of the problem of evil that I was reflecting on afterwards. So anyway, that was all a little bit inchoate, but this has some weight for me. Like I've had these sorts of experiences.
Yeah, so have I, and it has some weight for me too. I think this is correct insofar as there are these experiences. They do have these like atheistic contents, and they do supply at least some justification for those atheistic contents. I think this is absolutely a real phenomenon. Actually, the very first paper I ever published on the problem of evil is actually about the common sense problem of evil. It's just that it's hard to tell that that's what it's about because the title is something like, is the problem of evil a deontological problem? But in that paper, I argue that like one kind of interpretation that people have given at least some of these experiences is that, look, this evil is just absolutely impermissible. Like it's not possible that someone is justified in permitting this evil, something like that. And I argue that that's false, that either the experiences don't have that content, or if they do, then they're systematically misleading. But then I suggest a different interpretation of those experiences that says the modal content of the experience is not like, it's absolutely impossible that anybody is ever justified in permitting this or something like that. It's rather a deontological content. It's like, well, you're not justified in permitting this for the sake of good consequences, even if they're like outweighing or something, something more along those lines is what I point to. But anyway, okay. Common sense problem of evil. That's actually related to nice unplanned transition actually to non-consequentialist problems of evil. So there are a number of like versions of like problems of or arguments from evil that focus on non-consequentialist considerations of one sort or another. So for example, there's worries about like, well, does God intend evil? And especially depending on your views about divine providence, right? Like, so it's often the case that people will object to divine determinism on the grounds that it seems to make God like someone who intends the evil that happens in the world. And the worry here is the non-consequentialist worry that intending evil is either just never permissible or at least harder to justify than merely foreseeing evil. Similarly, does God do evil or merely allow it? Because again, some people argue that either it's just never permissible to do evil as opposed to merely allowing it, or that it's at least harder to justify doing than merely allowing evil. There's a whole, classic question like, did God create evil, right? And that's, again, the worry here is not just, how do you fit these things together, God and evil? It's not just, God's at least allowing the evil. It's the specific worry about, well, is there something especially bad about creating evil, right? And there are other kinds of non-consequentialist considerations as well. I, for example, and I'm not the only one, but one thing I've emphasized in some of my work is that there seems to be side constraints of a very robust sort, even on allowing really horrendous evils. Set aside, forget about, doing and intending, even allowing, right? It's not always okay to allow horrendous evils for the sake of good consequences. Anyway, well, actually, we'll probably talk a little bit more about that later. One more thing here. There's an argument from ordinary morality that Stephen Mateson, I don't actually know for sure how to pronounce his name, but I'm going with Mateson, developed in a paper called Ordinary Morality Implies Atheism. And he's drawing on some work by Jeff Jordan, though Jordan doesn't make quite the same argument. But he basically, what Mateson is saying is like, look, if theism is true, then this thesis called theodical individualism is true, which means something like roughly all suffering is good for the sufferer, like it's a net good for them. It ends up being for their good in some way. And then he wants to say, well, if that's true, then ordinary morality is out the window, because normally when we think about like our practical lives and what morality demands of us and so forth, we think, oh, yeah, we should prevent suffering when we can, and we shouldn't cause suffering and when we, there aren't like obviously good reasons to. Yet, depending on your approach to the problem of evil, if you want to say, well, all suffering is actually good for the victim, that seems to undermine that like component of ordinary morality. Okay, so again, that's something we're going to come back to. So I won't say anything further about it here. But anyway, so that's that took a while, but that was
yeah, we can go slightly faster going forward.
All right, yeah. Okay, good. So theodicies and defenses. So theodicies and defenses are basically hypotheses about why perhaps God permits the bad stuff in the world. All right. And these two terms, theodicy and defense, are defined in different ways by different people. So if it wasn't already complicated enough, so a theodicy, Alvin Plantinga was the one who introduced the distinction between theodicy and defense. And the way he characterized a theodicy is that it's a true account of the reasons God permits evil. And then he contrasted this with a defense, which he defined as, well, he didn't use this terminology, but the terminology he used means this: a metaphysically possible account of the reasons God permits evil. The terminology he liked to use was this notion of broad logical possibility, but that's kind of like an outdated bit of jargon, and what it meant was metaphysical possibility, what people nowadays call metaphysical. Anyway, okay. So Plantinga drew this distinction, and he says, look, you can tell a story and claim this is the truth about why God permits evil, or you can tell a story and say, well, this is at least metaphysically possible, like it could be. Not epistemic could, metaphysical could, that this is a reason God permits evil. Some people like Swinburne use theodicy in a less demanding sense. So Swinburne uses it to mean something like, oh, it's just got to be like a plausible story about why God allows evil. But you don't have to say, yep, this is the truth. And then some people use defense in a different way. So, for example, Peter van Inwagen uses the term defense to mean something more like an epistemically possible account of the reasons God permits evil. And he actually uses like a courtroom analogy. Like, look, it's what you want is the kind of story that, would undermine somebody giving God a guilty verdict in a courtroom, right? Like, it's a story that you are in no position to like reasonably rule out. Here's another term that is not nearly as widely used as theodicy and defense, but is, I think, much better than either the term theodicy or the term defense. Proust and Doherty have this paper where they use the term conciliatory story as basically a general term for any kind of hypothesis about God's reasons for letting bad stuff happen. They can range, right? Conciliatory stories can range from being very improbable to very probable. And so anything falling anywhere in that range is a kind of conciliatory story. I like that term, but unfortunately it's not mainstream in the literature, at least at this point. So, okay. I will probably, for the rest of this section, mostly just use the term theodicy because I'm used to using that term. However, I'm using it in the broad sense that something like conciliatory story.
I'll take it over from here,
Yep.
maybe. I wanted to touch on here conditions for a successful theodicy. So when we're examining theodicies and possibly also defenses and conciliatory stories, among other things, we should be asking the following sorts of questions. And I've kind of grouped these together into 5 different categories, and I'm going to give an acronym at the end to kind of help you guys remember it, because I think this is an incredibly empowering tool to be able to have these sorts of questions on your mind whenever you're evaluating someone coming up with a theodicy or a response to the problem of evil. Now, Justin will add something at the end that maybe these really only, or at least some of these, are only going to be applicable to theodicies which try to identify some greater good for which God permits evil. But I'll leave it to Justin to talk about that later. So one sort of condition is what we could call the scope condition. And with each of these conditions, you want to ask a question. So the question here is, does the theodicy account for all the data of evil and suffering? Maybe a bit more carefully, we want to ask, does it account for all the data at issue in a particular argument that the theodicy or defense is targeting? A second condition is what we can call the outweighing condition. And here we need to ask, does the relevant good identified by the theodicy or defense actually outweigh the relevant bads being explained by that good? Like if you go to the dentist or you go to the surgeon, and the surgeon really could have just given you a pill which just made you better immediately, solve the problem, or they could have opted for an extraordinarily expensive, like $30,000 surgery which caused you a ton of pain. But hey, you're still going to get better in the end. And let's suppose that getting better in the end is not worth $30,000, and that horrific, just what they're relieving you of is not worth that cost. If the doctor still goes through with that second option as opposed to the first option, just giving you the pill, it seems like the doctor has done something wrong. It seems like the relevant good needs to outweigh the bads that are supposed to be being explained by the good. So like they wouldn't work for the doctor to just say, well, hey, like I produced a good result from this $30,000 surgery that caused you immense pain. In that case, it seems like the relevant good doesn't outweigh the relevant bad. And in that case, we also flout the necessity condition, which is the next condition. We need to ask, are the relevant bads or their permission absolutely necessary for the obtaining of the relevant goods that are identified by the theodicy? In the doctor case, given that there's this alternative way to produce the same result, namely the pill, it seems like the doctor isn't justified in putting you through that sort of living hell, through this sort of surgery. They'd be doing something wrong if they did that. Instead, they should have given you the pill because they could have achieved the relevant good of you getting better without the relevant bads. So we also, it seems like, need something like a necessity condition. The relevant bads need to be absolutely necessary for the obtaining of the relevant good. Then we have the rights condition. Here we need to ask, does God have the right to secure the goods via doing or allowing those bads? In other words, is God doing something just kind of intrinsically impermissible, like impermissible in itself, even if it produces greater consequences in the end, even if those consequences are outweigh the relevant bad, so like they're really good consequences, they outweigh the relevant bad, and the relevant bad is necessary for producing those goods. The person who's securing those goods by means of allowing those bads still needs to have the right to sort of do that kind of thing. It needs to be permissible for them to do that in the first place. And there need to be no sort of geontic side constraints that are violated by the person who's permitting the relevant evils to transpire so as to secure the relevant goods in the end. So here, again, for the rights condition, we just need to ask, does God have the right to secure the goods via doing or allowing those bads? And then fifth and finally, we have the conflict condition. And here we basically just ask, does the theodicy or defense conflict with other things that it shouldn't conflict with? And what are those other things? Well, maybe a theodicy or defense could conflict with other aspects of the theistic hypothesis. Or maybe it could conflict with other responses to the problem of evil. Or maybe it could conflict with other arguments for theism. That's a significant result. Likewise, we need to ask, does the theodicy or defense conflict with other things that we have good reason to believe? So, for instance, if the theodicy or defense relies on there being like unicorns who's going to reward everyone for various things, we don't have good reason to believe that, and we have good reason to think that that's false. So that would be a problem for the theodicy as well. In short, we don't want a theodicy or defense to conflict with other things that it shouldn't conflict with, or that would at least pose some problems if it conflicted with them. And so here I have a kind of acronym. I didn't go through it in the order, but the acronym here is SCORN. Okay, SCORN. Scope, scope condition, conflict, outweighing, rights, and necessity. You basically need to think about these. Whenever you come across a evil or something like that, think, does this scope, does it account for all the relevant evil? Conflict, does it conflict with other things that we have good reason to believe in? Does it conflict with other responses to the problem of evil? Does it conflict with theism more generally? Outweighing, does the relevant good identified outweigh the relevant bad? Rights, does God have the right to basically allow the evil to occur for the sake of the greater good? And then necessity, is the evil actually needed for the good to obtain, or could you have achieved the good through other means that aren't as bad? Okay, so that's my little spiel. Justin can probably clean all that up because this is not my area of expertise. So I'll turn it over to Justin.
Yeah, so I mean, this is really good. I like this. So just in case we weren't totally clear about this yet. So this slide represents Joe's work, not mine. This is his list of conditions, and I think it's really good. At least a couple of them are controversial. And so the outweighing and the necessary condition, I think when we get to the Meta-Theodicy section of this presentation, maybe I'll wait until then to say something about like the people who want to sort of reject those as conditions for a successful theodicy and why. But for the most part, yeah, like a lot of theodicies are trying to satisfy all of these constraints. So
yeah, well, and one other thing, like I recognize, yes, that's a good point. Some of these are, controversial and controverted in the literature. That's absolutely correct. Although at least my sense is, and again, you have a better grasp of the literature here than I do, but at least my sense is that these are at least relatively widely recognized as conditions. Like, I mean, I go into, for instance, Michael Murray's book, Nature, Bread, and Tooth and Claw, and he like gives these as conditions that are pretty widespread. At least he seems to be saying that in like the first or the second chapter. At least he gives the outweighing, the necessity, and the rights condition. Yeah. And he says like, yeah, these plausibly need to be met, and he gives some motivations for thinking that they need to be met. So at least my sense is that these are like relatively popular.
Swinburne also has something like the outweighing, necessary, and rights conditions at the beginning of his book. And yeah, so I think you're right. They're all relatively popular. And that's partly because the most popular theodicies they have the sort of structure where what they're trying to do is justify the evil by satisfying these conditions. I would say the outweighing condition is I've seen more and more people challenge this lately.
Okay.
Like I think that condition in the last 5 years or say is coming under more and more scrutiny.
Okay.
But again, I think let's maybe talk more about that in the Meta-Theodicy section.
Okay, sweet.
All right. So I'm going to start with the by far most widely discussed approach to theodicy in the analytic tradition, and that is free will approaches to theodicy or defense, right? So these are extremely common, and more has been written about them than should have been written about them. It is, I think, the largest section of my bibliography is the free will section, and yeah, anyway, there's just so much on free will type approaches. And the rough idea of the free will theodicy is really simple. It's that suffering is a byproduct of freedom. But to spell that out a little bit more, the thought is supposed to be something like this. Freedom, and more specifically, freedom to choose between good and bad, is a good thing in itself. Or rather, it's a good thing. Some people will say it's intrinsically a good thing. Some people say extrinsically. But for one reason or other, it's supposed to be really valuable. And so for that reason, God wants us to have freedom. But in order for us to have freedom, it has to be the case that, the freedom to choose between good and bad, then it has to actually be possible for us to do bad things without God jumping in and stopping them from happening, because that would just be a kind of world where we didn't really have the freedom that supposedly, the view says we have, right? And so the thought is suffering ends up being a byproduct of people being given this good thing by God and then abusing it. And Joe and I were talking just before we started. I don't know, this is just me, this may not be a standard thing, but I think of primordial fall theodicies as being like a kind of free will theodicy. And so I kind of lump them together into this category. And so we might talk about those here as well. There are many, 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 many free will theodicies. Some of the influential ones, Plantinga, he brands as a defense, not a theodicy. Swinburne, Van Inwagen also casts his as a kind of defense rather than a theodicy. But anyway, and then many others.
So then for the outstanding issues here, maybe one problem, and we'll go through successive problems here. Maybe one problem is like a problem of scope. So we might think initially that, and the points here that I'm going to be making are going to be directed at least towards like a sort of generic free will theodicy or something like that. But I guess the scope problem would just be, it seems like free will theodicies can't account for at least lots of evil, and maybe even most evil, at least if we appeal to human free will alone. Like, of course, the thing that obviously comes to mind is like natural evil, or evil before humans were around, social evil, in fact, various other sorts of evil. So like that's a scope problem. I'll turn it over to you. What do you think about that?
This is definitely one of the most discussed problems about the free will defense is like, well, how do we extend this to natural evil, right? Social evil, there hasn't really been a whole lot of discussion about that at all at this point, but especially natural evil, a lot of stuff has been said. And I guess, one thing to do, I could do is just point to, so I've listed these three examples, Plantinga, Swinburne, Van Inwagen. So we could maybe just say what they say about it as just sort of an illustrative, like, here's something you could say, right? So Plantinga appeals to evil agents that are more powerful than human beings. So he wants to say, look, maybe there are demons and demons have messed with nature or something like that, right? And again, he's not claiming this is true. He's just saying it's metaphysically possible. So that's one possibility. It's not one that I take particularly seriously, but Swinburne has one of the more interesting moves. He wants to say, like, look, in order for us to have the kind of freedom that is worth having, where you can make a difference to like whether good or bad things happen in the world, you need to know how the world works. You need to know like what causes will produce what effects, and which of those effects will be the good ones and the bad ones and so forth. And in order to have that kind of knowledge, and also, not just, in order to have that kind of knowledge, he thinks you need to be in an environment that obeys certain like regular laws, and where there are in fact both good and bad things that happen naturally as a result of things just sort of following the laws of nature, because that's how you learn, like, okay, here's how I can manipulate my environment to do good or to do bad. And then he adds a further layer to this, and he says, moreover, when natural evil happens, that creates more opportunities to choose between the good and the bad, because you can either help those who are suffering as a result of the recent earthquake, or you can refrain from doing so, for example, right? So that's Swinburne's strategy to try to extend the free will defense, or his free will theodicy, to natural evil. Did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, maybe a few things. I mean, like, one thing we might think here is like, we might think you can gain that knowledge not through there being actual evil out there in the world, but instead through like dreams or revelation or certain other sorts of things, just inbuilt knowledge. So that's one thing. It doesn't seem like we need natural evil to have that kind of knowledge. I mean, another thing is like, there's a lot of natural evil that went on for hundreds of millions of years prior to humans who were around. Doesn't seem like this is going to be able to be extendable to that sort of evil. And then, of course, there are the other issues that would be applicable to free will theodicies more generally, like, I don't know, the relevant goods may not be worth it. And we'll get to those later. But let's turn to Van Inwagen then.
Sure. Okay. So Van Inwagen is kind of a primordial fall sort of dude. At any rate, again, he casts his as like an epistemic defense, like, well, this might be true for all we know, right? But his story is something like, well, there was this original population of hominids who had a certain kind of intimacy with God that it resulted in them being protected from natural harm and so forth. And then they fell, right? They started to do things that were wrong, and they kind of like turned their backs on God. And then as a result of that, they lost the special divine protection they had from the natural world. And they were also, of course, now, since they're now, doing wrong things, they might turn and start harming each other and so forth, like that, right? And Van Inwagen, there's more to Van Inwagen's story, but that's kind of the key thing. He's like, look, nature has all these dangerous things in it, but originally we were protected from those dangers by God, or by our special like relationship with God, and we lost that when we fell.
Yeah, so maybe some of the fall stuff will apply to that. So maybe we could just get on to some of the other potential problems. And maybe I'll just raise the problems successively, and then I'll just turn it over to you to offer thoughts on each of them. So maybe because that might be a little bit quicker than going back and forth on each of them.
Yeah.
So I guess a second problem that one might appeal to afflicting free will theodicies and defenses is a kind of necessity condition issue. So we might think that like morally significant freedom may not require the relevant or may not require even the permission of the relevant evils. And so we might think that the necessity condition isn't satisfied. So like one point here, and there are two kind of sub-points that I'd want to make. One point here is we might think that there's a particular difficulty with Christian theists appealing to this, because it might seem like God has morally significant freedom, but can't do evil, or at least doesn't in fact do evil. It might seem like Jesus has morally significant freedom, but it seems like Jesus couldn't have done something atrocious. Likewise, at least if you're Catholic, and some Protestants think that Mary was without sin, and it seems like she had morally significant freedom. Like we appropriately praise her and blame her, etc. Well, we don't blame her because she was blameless. We appropriately praise her for her, humility and various other virtues and whatnot. Likewise, I think you're going to touch on this later. Like people have pointed to like heaven. It seems like people in heaven are morally significantly free, but can't do evil. So that's one sort of sub-point applicable to Christian theists specifically, and any other theists who believe in heaven. I guess the second point here would also be free will theodicies might rest on something like an incompatibilist view, because I mean, if we accept compatibilism, then, and even arguably if we accept Molinism, arguably if we accept one of those two, God could have created beings with morally significant freedom, but who never do wrong. So like under the compatibilism side, like, I don't know, there are lots of defensible compatibilist accounts of morally significant freedom. God could have given us that kind of freedom, and we could have that kind of freedom even without the possibility of misusing it, like, because compatibilism says that we can have that freedom and yet be determined to always do the good. And under Molinism, like very plausibly, we might think there are like at least like continuum many creaturely essences. So that's a very large infinity of creaturely essences equipped with like different counterfactuals of creaturely freedom that are true of them, like what they would do, what they would freely do in various circumstances. And we might think that the very fact that there are so many creaturely essences endowed with the relevant kind of libertarian freedom is going to make it antecedently extraordinarily probable that God would have opened to him like a world ensemble like ours, containing, like creatures and beautiful structures and whatnot for extended periods of time. But whose free creatures are kind of saintly creatures. They never, in fact, do wrong. They have counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, which are very saintly. The creatures never go wrong. We might think that that's antecedently incredibly, incredibly likely, given the infinitude of possible creatures, and given that certain plausible maybe principles of difference or whatever. But anyway, I'll turn it over to you maybe at least for that problem, the kind of necessity condition, because there's a lot there, and I'm interested if you just have any commentary.
Yeah, so on the issues about wait, aren't Christians, for example, committed to certain cases of people who are free yet unable to do evil, right? So there's a body of literature on the heaven version of that problem about well, wait, aren't we going to be free in heaven and yet unable to do evil? And what the most popular strategy for addressing that is to appeal to a tracing account of free will, like a Robert Cain kind of view, where what happens, the thought is well, by the time you get to heaven, you've made a series of choices over the course of at least one and maybe multiple lifetimes that have led to you forming your character in such a way that you are no longer able to choose evil. But because your undetermined choices resulted in your character being in that way, you count as freely continuing to choose not to do
right.
Right. So that's the main move that people make. It's not the only one. Similarly, there's a body of literature on the question about divine freedom. Well, wait a second. Why isn't God free, and yet God can't do evil? So why can't we be free and unable to do evil? There's a literature on that. And again, one of the moves that people talk about is trying to develop an incompatibilist theory of freedom that allows you to say that God is like a special exception because nothing caused God to have the character that God has, and it's essential to God that God has that character. So this is Kevin Timpe, who defends a sourcehood version of libertarianism, uses it to try to defend a move like that. And there are some other possibilities as well. So yeah, there's a whole discussion about those kinds of things. I don't know if there's literature on Mary. There might be in Catholic journals that I'm not familiar with. There is literature that I'm aware of on the incarnation and the freedom of Christ in the incarnation. Actually, there's quite a bit of work on that now, and that is also a really interesting topic, but I don't want to get into it.
Right, that's fair.
Yeah. So, okay. So the other thing, abstracting away from Christianity or other maybe very specific religious commitments. So you have this worry about well, depending on how you think about divine providence, right? If you're a theological determinist or a Molinist, you might think surely God could set up the circumstances so that people just always use their freedom well, right? And some people, yes, do push that line of thought. Others on the one way of dealing with that, of course, is just to reject both divine determinism and Molinism. But there are other ways to go as well. So some people a number of people have tried to defend versions of free will defenses and theodicies that actually are compatibilist. They make use of a compatibilist notion of freedom. And they might be right, they might be wrong as to whether those are defensible, but anyway, they exist. And then on the point about Molinism, right? So the worry is well, wait a second, given all the possible people and all the ways that the counterfactuals of freedom can be distributed across those people, surely there's going to be some, feasible world, to use Flint's term, where people are free but never go wrong, right? So one way to try to resist this problem, other than just either abandoning Molinism or abandoning, the appeal to free will as a solution to the problem of evil, there's a non-standard version of Molinism that Linda Zagzebski talks about but doesn't endorse, that says, well, look, some people like Arthur Pryor have suggested there are no singular facts about individuals before they exist. There's only like qualitative facts. And so if that's true, then before I come to exist, there are no counterfactuals about me. It's only once I begin to exist, then all of a sudden there are a whole bunch of counterfactual truths of freedom about what I would do in various circumstances, right? But so this is basically throwing out the Plantinga picture of like, well, there are all these creaturely essences and all these counterfactuals of freedom about what instantiations of those essences would do, and saying, no, you actually don't have that information. You need the individuals first before you get the counterfactuals of freedom about them.
I have decided that like if we go through all these problems for all the Theodicies as well, like we're never going to be done.
Yeah.
So I'll make like a separate video of my own, just at least outlining for people some ways that people have tried to push back on the relevant Theodicies. And then going forward, I'll just let you present your outstanding issues for each of them and just like at least briefly discuss them. So
Sure.
I won't be relying as much going forward on my document. I'll just make a separate video on my document. So more content. So everyone stay tuned for another video, but Justin's really going to be taking the reins from now on, and I'm not going to intervene all that much.
Okay, cool. So outstanding issues. So, things that people are talking about or have been talking about in the literature concerning free will theodicies. We just talked about this one. Can free will theodicies be extended to natural evil? We just talked about this one as well. Do free will theodicies require indeterminism? We haven't talked about this one yet, but there's the question of whether free will is valuable enough to outweigh evil. This is a point that Laura Ekstrom really pushes in her book, relatively recent book on the problem of evil, where she's like, look, free will is just not good enough, to be worth the like really horrible evils that there are in the world, right? And I think this is a really important issue. One, I think, relevant distinction that people thinking about this need to look at is the distinction between like an isolated case where it's just really obvious, like, of course, you should prevent the axe murderer from murdering this person, and not say, well, but like I would be interfering with their freedom, right? Like, okay, no, clearly you should stop the axe murder, right? But that's an isolated case. The real question I think that we need to focus on is what are the different kinds of worlds that we're imagining God choosing between? And is a world where no one ever has the freedom to do anything significantly bad, is that, is something like, we want to compare that to a world where, horrible evils happen. And here, I think the difference is, Swinburne talks about like, a world like that, things might matter a little bit, but not very much. So there's this issue of like, well, how much is at stake? How meaningful are the actions that anyone ever performs, right? And I, at any rate, speaking for myself, I have different intuitions when we compare worlds in that way than when I think about isolated individual cases and what a human ought to do in those cases. So it's like you could also think of it as a difference between thinking in terms of divine policies versus thinking in terms of like a specific case and what a bystander should do. Okay, so that's an outstanding issue. Another one is free will. Yeah, is the free will theodicy consistent with free will in heaven? We talked about that. We also talked about this one, divine freedom. That's a bit about free will theodicies. Ready for soul-making theodicies, Joe?
Absolutely. And yeah, like I said, I'll edit this editorializing out, but I'm going to make a separate video where I just like basically go through the document that I made and at least just talk about it a little bit. And then here you'll basically just be taking the reins.
All right, cool. Okay, so soul-making and intimacy theodicies. So this, I would say, is the second most popular, or at least widely discussed, approach to the problem of evil in the analytic tradition. And the rough idea of the soul-making theodicy is that suffering promotes character building. In a little more detail, the thought is this. One of the most valuable things that there is, you might think, is virtue. And so that's something that God might be interested in having in the world. But lots of virtues, when you think about it, are actually like responses to bad things. So for example, Courage is a response to danger. Compassion is a response to suffering. Forgiveness is a response to wrongdoing. Perseverance is a response to like prolonged hardship of some sort. And so the thought here is like, well, look, if God wants there to be a world where people develop and exercise virtue, it's important that world be a place where bad things happen sometimes, so that people have an opportunity to respond to them in virtuous ways. Okay, so that's the idea. The contemporary defender, the main contemporary defender of this theodicy, he's no longer living, but John Hick, and he attributes it to the church father Irenaeus, and is kind of like responsible for reviving it in the contemporary discussion. And then other people have defended versions of this view as well. For example, Doherty has a soul-making theodicy that he calls a saint-making theodicy. Okay, and then there's a related type of theodicy, or at least I see them as kind of closely related, that I call intimacy theodicies, where the idea is that suffering promotes intimacy with God or others in some way. Right. Not the same thing as character building, but there's similarity in that suffering is supposed to be like, promoting the personal growth or development in some way of individual people. Okay, so people who've defended intimacy theodicies, as I've characterized them here, include Marilyn Adams, Eleanor Stump, Laura Ekstrom, formerly when she was previous, as far as I understand, I don't know her personally, but she was at one point a Christian and is now, I think, an atheist or maybe an agnostic. And then Robin Collins has this really interesting theodicy called the connection building theodicy. And I guess I'm not going to go into it a whole lot here. You can read about it in the Blackwell Companion to the Problem of Evil. I think of it as kind of fitting into this category. But the rough idea is just that by the way when people interact with each other, they establish certain kinds of relational connections between each other that grow in value over time as the people continue to be in relationship with each other. And Collins wants to say that the value of these connections can just sort of grow almost ad infinitum. And as time just goes on and on and on, right? And that this can make suffering worthwhile when the suffering is integral to the connection that's established. Okay, so soul-making and intimacy theodicy, some outstanding issues about these, some things people are talking about in the literature. One is, do they extend to non-human animals? Some people say yes, some people say no. It's certainly easier to see how they apply to human beings than how they apply to animals, but there's a debate about that. Another issue, do they undermine ordinary morality? Because again, this is the kind of theodicy where it starts to look like we're saying suffering is usually good for a person in some way, like at least in the long run. And then that begins to threaten like the way we normally think about morality and the moral demands that we have on us to prevent suffering and not to cause suffering. Another issue, are the goods good enough? Like, is virtue actually a good enough good to be worth the cost of horrendous evil? One comment about this, I think, is there are definitely cases that you can imagine where it seems like there's like a trade-off between virtue and a horrendous evil, like, and it just seems like very clearly like, okay, you should not subject this person to this horrendous evil just because, it might make them more patient or more courageous or something, right? In fact, that just seems fairly obvious. Like, you don't go around subjecting people to horrendous evils because you're like, well, I'm going to try to make people, more courageous. But I actually think that the intuition motivating that kind of thought is not about the value, the degree of value. It's not that the good isn't good enough, or at least it's not clear to me that that's what's going on. I actually think it's more of a side constraint, a deontological issue. And that's because when I think about it this way, like, suppose you imagine choosing for yourself what kind of life you get to live. And maybe you get the choice between a life where you remain morally immature, but you're comfortable, and a life where you are not comfortable. You often suffer, sometimes perhaps horribly, but you become much better person over the course of time. Just speaking for myself, I would choose that second life. And that makes me think that what's going on, that actually, the virtue is worth the cost of a great deal of suffering, but that there are side constraints on, like, you can't just go around causing people to suffer for the sake of virtue, not because it's not worth it necessarily, but because there are moral rules about what you can do without people's consent, for example, right? And what you can do to people who just aren't you. And you can get around those rules to see what your intuitions are when we get them out of the way by asking, what would you choose for yourself in relevant circumstances? So anyway, something to think about. Okay, so this third category, this might seem a little bit odd that I've included a whole slide on karma and rebirth theodicies. It might seem odd because this isn't super prominent in the analytic literature. I think it's becoming more prominent. There's more work being done on this that's at least interacting with analytic philosophy. But it's not like one of the big ones in the analytic tradition. The reason that I've included this, well, two things. One is I've been working on this recently, so I'm super interested in it. But the other reason is this is the dominant approach to the problem of evil in the Indian philosophical tradition, which is another philosophical tradition where theism has a really important role to play. There's lots of different philosophical schools in the history of Indian philosophy and in current Indian philosophy. Some of them are theistic, some of them aren't. But some of them are theists in a very recognizable sense if you're coming from a Judeo-Christian or Abrahamic kind of perspective, right? There are some really prominent traditions in Indian philosophy that say there is a God that is all-powerful and all-knowing and perfectly good. And they have the problem of evil in the same form that those of us in the Abrahamic traditions do. And their traditional way of dealing with it, by far the most common way of dealing with it in Indian philosophy, is to do some kind of karma or rebirth theodicy. So here's what those theodicies say. They say that instances of suffering, at least some of them, maybe all of them, it depends on the theodicy, are karmic consequences of past actions. So you do things, good and bad, you accumulate good and bad karma. That karma comes back and gets you later, causes either good things or bad things, depending on, your past actions. And it could be within the single lifetime or over the course of many lifetimes. It could be the things happening to you in this lifetime are the result of actions you performed in previous lifetimes, right? So one thing that's kind of nice about this theodicy, one thing that I think has drawn a number of people to it, is that it's really easy to basically account for any kind of evil whatsoever, no matter how hard it is to find the good reason why God would let this happen, because you can always say that the good reason is hidden away in another lifetime, right? It's, yes, this innocent person is suffering. Well, innocent in this lifetime, but who knows what they did in a previous lifetime, right? That's the thought anyway. There are basically two main kinds of karma and rebirth theodicies. Some of them, traditionally, they focus on retribution. But in the last couple of hundred years, and including the last 5 years, people have developed more like character or soul building type karma theodicies, and those are pretty interesting. Okay, so people who defend this, Shankara and Ramanuja, who are both really influential Vedanta philosophers from the history of Indian philosophy. Goldschmidt and Secord, contemporary philosophers who have a paper in Faith and Philosophy from a number of years ago defending a rebirth theodicy that's kind of like a Jewish take on this. So I should clarify, this is not an exclusively Indian idea. It's just really prominent in Indian philosophy. And then Akshay Gupta, who's been doing a lot of really interesting work applying ideas from analytic philosophy to ideas in Indian philosophy. Okay, so here are some outstanding issues when you look at the literature on karma and rebirth theodicies. One is, do they violate constraints on just retribution? There are a number of such constraints that people talk about. One, for example, would be like, well, wait a second. We don't at least normally remember any previous lives. Is it okay for somebody to experience retribution for something in a life that they don't even remember having? So anyway, questions like that arise. Do they explain the origin of suffering? So traditionally, there was the claim was that the sort of karmic chain of causation just goes back forever, infinitely. And also, along with that traditional claim, it was also the traditional belief in Indian philosophy that the universe is cyclic, and it just kind of new universe is created every once in a while, and it lasts, and then it's destroyed, and then it's created again, and then it just goes on forever. And the whole process of karmic causation just continues, and people just keep getting reborn and reborn and reborn and reborn and reborn. And so some people worry about being committed to infinite regresses or infinite causal regresses or whatever. Even if you're not worried about that, there's the question of why would God create an infinite world with suffering rather than an infinite one where people always choose good and it's only good karma or something like that, right? And then a number of people, including, for example, Goldschmidt and Secord, have suggested, well, actually, maybe we should say that the karmic process is kicked off by some kind of a primordial fall. This has become a popular suggestion, actually, in recent work on this topic. And that, of course, brings in with it all kinds of, the usual problems for primordial fall theodicies. Okay, do they undermine ordinary morality? Big topic. Probably the most influential contemporary paper on this topic of karma and karmic theodicy. What is that guy's name? Kaufman, Whitley Kaufman. He's got a paper, I don't remember what it's called, but anyway, it's easy to find, where he really pushes this point. Look, if all suffering is karmic retribution, ordinary morality is out the window. All of a sudden, nothing is like a horrifying tragedy that we should try to prevent and that we should have attitudes of moral horror about. It's all just just retribution. It's everything is deserved, right?
Yeah, you deserve this. Well, I stopped to intervene and you deserve this, bro.
Yep. And so that seems like a really bad problem. Here's another, I think, really bad problem. There's a whole discussion about victim blaming and whether it seems like karmic theodicies, or at least some of them, engage in a kind of victim blaming. And when you look at what people say in this, I think it is plausible that there are maybe some permissible cases of victim blaming, or at least what might be called victim blaming. So, for example, one example in the literature is the case of a doctor who informs her patient that the patient got cancer because of their smoking habit, right? Okay, you might call that a kind of victim blaming in some technical sense, but there doesn't seem to be anything wrong with it. But some people worry about are karmic theodicies engaged in the sort of victim blaming that we think is morally unacceptable? And I think this is a really important worry for these theodicies, and also not just these. I mean, it's really obvious worry for karma theodicies, but as some other people have actually pointed out to me, there are some other theodicies, including some other famous ones, which might be vulnerable to similar kinds of worries. Okay.
Yeah, one other thing that I'd very briefly add here is that, arguably these sorts of theodicies rely on at least contentious views about personal identity that one might reject.
Yep,
so,
absolutely.
At least certain reductionists about personal identity take it to be a matter of maybe psychological continuity or bodily continuity. And we might think that these sorts of views would involve, significant violations of a kind of psychological continuity or bodily continuity, such that it just couldn't be the same person, one and the same individual beforehand and, in between lives, as it were. And so one might think that could pose problems for the justness of punishing a current person for what a numerically distinct individual did in a previous life. And maybe other views here could likewise pose trouble. Maybe if you're an animalist, you might think this is particularly difficult. You might think that an animal's life is just exhausted by, its current biological life from, whatever, conception to death or whatever. So, there's some somewhat crazy views here, like body snatching that you could go for, or or weird sort of fissioning cases that Dean Zimmerman proposes. So there's weird stuff that you might be able to propose under animalism for these sorts of scenarios, but you're starting to get into wacko land when you do that. But anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I think of that objection as falling under the first category of constraints on just retribution. Because one plausible constraint is, you shouldn't punish somebody for something that somebody else did. And that some people think that's false, or that at least has to be qualified. But at any rate, something in that neighborhood is very plausible. And then the worry is, well, can you retain the relevant kind of identity across lives and across very different kinds of rebirth, like rebirth as an animal or something like that? In some of these traditions, you can even be reborn as a plant. And so, that obviously exacerbates some of those problems. Okay. Here's a category of theodicy that I'm just going to I'm going to be quick here. I'm not going to talk a lot about these, but I call these global value theodicies because instead of focusing on individuals and like individual development or individual retribution or something, they're focusing on values that accrue to the world as a whole. And the thought is that suffering is important for securing these values. So these include best possible world theodicies, which were like famously inaugurated by Leibniz. No best world theodicies, which say, hey, look, maybe there just is no best world for any world you pick. There are better worlds that God could pick instead. So there's just no top, right? And so God just has to satisfice. You pick a good enough world. Maybe this is a good enough world. The Felix Kulpa theodicy, which is most famously defended by Alvin Plantinga, though I don't think he invented. I think the right thing to say is he introduced it to the analytic literature, but it was already, I think, present in the Reformed theological tradition. But anyway, his thought is, look, incarnation and atonement are really, 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 really good things. Any world that contains them is a really good world. In fact, it's better than any world that doesn't contain them. But any world that contains them also has a lot of evil and suffering in it, because that's the whole point of the incarnation and the atonement. It's like a rescue mission from sin and its consequences and so forth. So anyway, that's what's going on there. Gnomic order, fine-tuning, and evolutionary theodicies. So these are the kinds of theodicies that say things like, well, wait a second, what if the suffering in the world is actually required by like the physical structure of the world in some way? Like, in order for the world to be a physically regular world that is suitable for complex organisms, that undergoes a kind of autonomous evolutionary process or something, maybe that just requires suffering. Like, how do we know that there's a physically possible universe that has those kinds of features and that doesn't have significant suffering, right? So some people like that kind of move. Van Inwagen, for example, defends something like that kind of a theodicy when it comes to animal suffering. There are multiverse theodicies, and so these tend to say things like, well, look, maybe God just makes all of the possible universes that meet some sort of value threshold. And that includes a bunch of universes that have suffering. It's just that they can't have too much suffering. And so as long as our universe meets the threshold, it's going to be one of the universes, one of the many that God has made. There are also multiverse theodicies that say things like, there's certain values that you can only get that are instantiated by having them be instantiated by like pluralities of universes and not by individual universes. So there's that as well. Narrative and progress theodicies. So you do have some people who argue that, well, maybe there's something about like the narrative of history that's really valuable, and that suffering has an integral role to play in this, or forget about like the details of history, but just like the narratival aspect of like life and living in a world like this. And then similarly, people who talk about like progress, like, well, maybe we're like on this trajectory of progress of like working towards eliminating more and more suffering and evil in the world, and there's a value in that. There is something to the intuition that progress is valuable, that going from bad to good is better than going from good to bad, for example. So anyway, some people have tried to use that for the purposes of theodicy. Okay, and then there are still other theodicies. One thing I wanted to emphasize in this presentation that I think people don't always realize is just how many theodicies there are, right? Because there are certain really well-known ones, and then there's like an absolute horde of less well-known ones. And maybe they're less well-known for a good reason. Maybe they're not very plausible. But there's just a ton of theodicies out there. So here are some more. Epistemic theodicies. Some people want to say that there are certain kinds of knowledge that we only attain by experiencing suffering, and that's key to theodicy. Aesthetic theodicies, right? Some people want to say that aesthetic value, there's certain kinds of aesthetic value that you can only get at the cost of suffering, and that is involved in theodicy. Hasker defends this moral motivation theodicy, where the thought is, look, there has to be gratuitous suffering in the world, or else we wouldn't be motivated to act morally and try to stop, gratuitous suffering from happening. We would always we would know, like, anytime suffering happens, well, God's got a good reason for it, so we better not interfere, right? And so it would kind of undermine our moral motivation. And so as not to undermine that motivation, God allows there to be gratuitous evil. So that's at least the core of Hasker's theodicy. Non-identity theodicies, which want to say that, like, look, in order to create particular people, it is essential to those people that they have certain histories, and those histories may include suffering, right? So, like, it may be that in order for me to come into existence, it had to be my parents and the particular sperm and egg that came together. I couldn't have come from a different sperm and egg. I couldn't have come from different parents, right? But then, what was involved in my parents meeting? And you start, like, tracing the history backwards, and you start finding, like, well, maybe huge portions of history are actually, like, essential to my existence. And so if God wanted to create me, then maybe God would have to permit, the suffering that is in the relevant parts of my history, right? So that's the rough idea of what non-identity theodicies are trying to do. There are different versions of them. I think some are more plausible than others. Non-consequentialist theodicies, these try to say that there are, like, moral duties of a sort that God must respect, either because God is bound by them or because a perfect being would act in accord with them, even if not bound by them. And that certain of these duties actually require God to permit suffering, potentially even gratuitous suffering. So I have a paper sort of sketching a theodicy like this, or more of like a formula for a theodicy like this. And Eric Reeton has a paper doing something similar. So this is an area where there's been at least a little work. Changing the past theodicies. So Tyrone Goldschmidt and Sam Liebens have
defended the promise of a new past. I love this paper.
Yeah, it's such a fun paper. And also in Liebens' book, he's got a book, what's it called? Principles of Judaism. He talks about it in there as well. But it's like this theodicy that says, well, look, maybe God can just come along later and undo history or parts of it, and just make it so that all the suffering and evil that has happened never happened. And it's super interesting. It's wild.
A little shout out. Early on in my channel's history, I actually had Sam Liebens and Ryan Mullins on to talk about hypertime, and among other things, they talked about this proposal. So check out, for the audience, one of the authors of this theodicy. Check out that discussion. I might have it pop up in the corner. So yeah.
Nice. Okay, cool. Process theist theodicies. This is a part of the literature that I am not really very familiar with, so I'm not going to say much here, because if I do, I'll end up saying things that are false. But anyway, process theism is a whole kind of movement of its own that accepts certain limitations of divine power, as I understand it, and uses that as part of their story of making sense of the evil and suffering in the world. Relatedly, and more generally, finite deity theodicies. So, the problem of evil, as I've said, it primarily targets the notion of a God that's all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good. So one way to deal with it, and one way some people do deal with it, is say, well, God's not like that. God isn't all-powerful, or isn't all-knowing, or isn't perfectly good. Computer simulation theodicies. So Barry Dainton, I believe, and then Dustin Crummett both have papers on this idea. And again, I have to admit, I have not read these papers, so I don't know a lot about how this theodicy works, but it's out there. And then demonic theodicies, which we touched on a little bit earlier. So maybe the evil and suffering in the world is at least partly caused by demons or Satan or something like that. So there are some people who work on or who have worked on that idea. Did you want to say anything further about that, Joe, or do you want to save that?
I'm gonna save that. I have so many things to say about this, but I really don't like it. But you can continue.
Yeah, I don't like it either. um, it is one of my least favorite Theodicies, but it's there, it's out there, and some people have defended it. And then there are others. So this list, long as it is not exhaustive. Okay, there we go. We are now on the category of epistemic defenses. So, what are epistemic defenses? Well, this is my term for strategies that try to block arguments from evil by saying, well, look, we don't even need to tell a story about like, well, here's why God allows evil and suffering to occur, but rather, there are just good reasons independently of having a story like that to think that these arguments from evil fail. Reasons often having to do something with our limited epistemic resources, our like limited knowledge, that sort of thing, right? And the most influential of these by far is skeptical theism. So what is skeptical theism? Here's my attempt to define it. Skeptical theism says that because of our cognitive limitations, our inability to think of a defensible theodicy is not evidence, or at least not much evidence, that there is no defensible theodicy. All right. And one way to really kind of really quickly grasp the motivating the sort of plausibility behind this view is there's an analogy called the parent analogy that is prominent in the literature on skeptical theism. And it just says, look, like imagine, think about all the sorts of things that parents subject their young children to, that those children often find unpleasant or don't like. And the children are just totally incapable of understanding why they're being subjected to these unpleasant things. So, for example, I was at a talk about skeptical theism once, and a friend of mine in the Q&A raised his hand and said, I have this infant daughter. I just took her to get some vaccines. It wasn't a pleasant experience for her, right? It's painful. But I didn't explain to her like why I was doing this to her, because she wouldn't understand, right? She's a baby. And the thought here with the skeptical theist is like our relationship to God is kind of like the relationship of the young child to the parent. God knows way more than we do. And so it could be that God's reasons for allowing us to suffer are good reasons that are just sort of beyond our ability to understand. Okay, so that's the rough idea of skeptical theism. It comes in many flavors. So I like to distinguish negative from positive forms of skeptical theism. Negative forms say that we have no evidence against the view that there are some like hidden divine reasons for the suffering that we see in the world, right? Like there could be such reasons. We've really got no strong evidence either way. And then positive forms, and I should say here, John DePoe, I believe, coined the term positive skeptical theism. But positive forms say, we actually do have evidence for hidden divine reasons. That is, we have evidence, a reason to think that God has good reasons for allowing the bad stuff in the world that are hidden from us, inaccessible to us. So again, DePoe is kind of like the pioneer, sort of positive skeptical theism. One qualification there is that Wykstra has a paper from the 1990s where he develops what I take to be a sort of a kind of positive skeptical theism. So many versions. I've listed a bunch of names here. And again, these are not just people who defend skeptical theism, but each one of them represents a significantly different kind of skeptical theism, at least in my estimation. Steve Wykstra, by the way, is usually credited with kind of initiating the contemporary literature on skeptical theism. He had a paper that he published in 1984 that's called something like The Humean Obstacle to Evidential Arguments from Evil, where he defends a principle he calls cornea, which is like a sort of an acronym for conditions on reasonable epistemic access. And it's supposed to be a principle on stating like conditions under which we are warranted in making certain kinds of inferences based on the evidence that we have, right? And his version of skeptical theism has proved influential. However, I think that over the long term, There's another form of skeptical theism that has actually been even more, eventually proved to be even more influential, and that is Mike Bergman's. So I want to take a look at his. So Bergman's skeptical theism, the short version is, he endorses skepticism concerning the total population of goods and evils, their necessary interrelations, and their degree of value. So the way he actually states this in his work is he states a number of separate theses that say things like, we don't know whether the goods that we know about are representative of the total population of goods that there are. And similarly with evils and necessary connections between goods and evils, right? So this is the kind of view. And what he wants to do is say, look, because we are in that situation, we cannot reasonably infer, if we think, look, there are some evils such that there are no outweighing goods that are necessitated by those evils, right? And if you think that there have to be goods like that in order for God to be justified in permitting the evil, what Bergman wants to say is, well, we can't infer from the fact that we don't know that there are any goods like that. We can't infer that there are no goods like that because we don't know whether the goods that we know about are representative in the relevant respect of all the goods that there are, right? There might be some unknown greater good connected to that evil. And we're in no position to rule that out with any confidence. Okay, so that's what Bergman's trying to do. Whole bunch of discussions about surrounding skeptical theism in general and often focusing on a Bergman style version of it. One of them is skeptical theism refuted by slippery slope objections. And what I mean by this is there's a whole bunch of objections in the literature to skeptical theism that say, look, if you are skeptical in the way the skeptical theist is, you also have to be skeptical about a whole bunch of other things that you probably don't want to be skeptical about. So, for example, the moral paralysis objection is along these lines. It says, look, if we are in no position to say, that there's not some greater good connected to this evil, then not only should we not say, oh, well, God has no good reason to prevent this evil, but we should also say we have no good reason we don't know, if we have a good reason to prevent this evil or not. So you end up with this moral paralysis, you don't know what to do, whether, when something bad is happening, do you intervene and stop it or do you not? You don't know, because you don't know what greater goods, some hidden unknown greater goods might be connected to it. So that seems like a bad consequence, right? And so there's a whole discussion about, does skeptical theism actually lead to that sort of moral skepticism, or does it not? And similarly for other types of skepticism, external world skepticism about induction, about divine testimony, all sorts of skepticisms have been claimed at one point or another to be consequences of skeptical theism. So there's a lot of discussion of this. Another outstanding issue is skeptical theism refuted by equiprobability objections. I'm using here Perry Hendrick's term. Hendricks, if I remember correctly, wants to say that these are probably the strongest objections to skeptical theism. And the rough idea is look, all right, we see a child drowning. We know that that's at least pro tanto very bad. Yeah, there could be some unknown good reasons to permit that pro tanto very bad thing to happen, but equally there could be some unknown good reasons, further reasons to prevent it from happening. And so the unknown reasons are kind of a wash. They sort of cancel each other out in terms of what we know anyway. And so you should just say, well, look, all I know is it's pro tanto very bad. Let's stop it. And then similarly, so that's thinking about it deliberating from a human perspective. But if you're thinking about well, what should God do? Similarly, well, if it's a pro tanto very bad thing, that's a strong reason, prima facie, a pro tanto reason to think that God should prevent this. Sure, there might be unknown reasons for God to permit it, but equally there might be unknown additional reasons for God to prevent it. So those reasons sort of cancel out when you're just trying to sort of guess what is most probably the situation here. And so you should conclude, well, most probably God should intervene. Anyway, okay, so that's equiprobability objections. again, another sort of ongoing discussion. Does skeptical theism undermine natural theology? So you might think, and some people have argued, well, look, if we can't predict what God would do, then not only does this undermine arguments from evil, because we can't say, oh, God wouldn't let those things happen, but it also undermines at least a great deal of the arguments for the existence of God, right? Because we can't say that God would make a fine-tuned universe with conscious beings and regular laws of nature, or that God would make something contingent, right? We just can't predict what God's going to do at all. So it sort of undercuts not only arguments from evil, but you might think also most of natural theology. So that's another discussion. And then, which arguments from evil does skeptical theism actually block? All right, so it was the paradigm kind of argument that it's like really designed to tackle is the William Rowe type of argument that we looked at earlier, the inductive argument in the narrow sense of inductive, right? And so it looks like, it's like tailor-made to block that kind of argument. And actually, as I saw Perry Hendricks make this comment not too long ago, something to the effect that, skeptical theism's popularity may be partly due to the fact that those Rowe-style arguments were, at around the same time, extremely popular and being widely discussed, right? But there's a debate about like whether skeptical theism also blocks like Bayesian or other abductive arguments from evil. There's also a debate about whether skeptical theism neutralizes the common sense problem of evil. Again, not exactly an argument, but at any rate, a problem of evil. And so there's some literature on both of those issues. Finally, does skeptical theism solve, does it solve the common sense problem of evil? So I just mentioned that. I'll just say one further thing here. These are all ongoing discussions. Perry Hendricks recently published a book on skeptical theism, and he tries to address all of these issues. I don't think he's successful on all of these counts, but he definitely has some interesting things to say. So if you're interested in skeptical theism, Perry's book is like the perfect place right now to go for like an updated discussion of what's going on in the skeptical theism literature. And Joe, yeah. I believe you have a video about this, right?
Yes, everyone on my channel, or everyone listening right now, should see my conversation with Perry Hendricks. I've linked it in the description. We discuss basically most of these issues, I think all these issues that you just mentioned, and a number of others. So yeah, we basically survey a lot of the most, if not all, the major objections in the extant literature on skeptical theism. So people can check that out. I mean, I and a number of commenters aren't, fully convinced that he succeeds, but he gives a robust defense, and people should definitely check it out.
All right. Perfect. Okay, so that's a very influential kind of skeptical theism. What I want to do, again, there are lots of others, but what I want to do now is talk about what is not at least normally classified as a kind of skeptical theism, but which is definitely what I'm calling an epistemic defense. And I'm just going to call it the anomaly defense. So this comes from a paper by Doherty and Pruce called Evil and the Problem of Anomaly. And it's in Oxford Studies in Philosophy of Religion. It's a little bit hard to access. I don't know that there's any like easily accessible version of the paper online, unfortunately, but it's a really interesting paper. It is one of my, sorry.
I said it's a good paper.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's one of my favorite papers on the problem of evil. So I really like this paper. And so here's the rough idea of what they want to say here. They want to say, look, apparently gratuitous evils that seem gratuitous at least, should be treated like anomalies for theism. And here's what that means, right? So scientific theories often entail universal generalizations of the form all A's are B's. And it's also frequently the case that scientific theories suffer from anomalies, which are apparent counterexamples to the generalizations they entail, like apparent cases of like an A that's not a B. But it's also often the case that those anomalies do not refute the theory. So here's an example, which I'm stealing from the paper in question. Suppose, this is, as far as I know, this is true. This is a true scientific theory. All foxes are canids. Okay. It's really easy to find an apparent counterexample to the claim that all foxes are canids, right? I think they actually say in the paper, just go and Google fox that looks like a cat, right? And you'll find a fox that looks more like a cat than a dog. Easy. But it would be a really bad inference to say, well, look, that is a counterexample to this theory, so it is false that all foxes are canids. Why would that be a bad inference? Well, because of the combination of two things. First, we would expect, given that the theory is true, there to be apparent counterexamples, because, as they say in the paper, there's enough morphological variation in foxes to expect that, okay, every once in a while you might get one that looks very much like a cat, right? And then in addition to that, you're using a biased selection procedure to find those cases, right? You're going and looking specifically for the cat-like foxes. And of course, they're there to be found. So you're going to find one even if the theory is true. And so it's a bad inference to say, oh, I found one, and therefore the theory is false. And so what Doherty and Proust want to say is you can kind of do the same thing with the problem of evil. You can say, look, if theism is true, arguably that predicts this generalization, that all evils are non-gratuitous. But given the complexity of the world and our limited information and so forth, you would also expect there to be at least some evils that really look gratuitous, where we're like, yeah, I don't know what God's doing there, or why God is like. That wouldn't be surprising, right? And if you go looking for them then, specifically for those, then you're going to find them because they're there to be found. And Doherty and Proust want to say this is pretty much exactly what people like Rowe and Tooley are doing when they zero in on a particular instance of evil that's hard to explain for the theist. What they've done is they have used a biased selection procedure to find what like an anomaly for theism, an anomaly which theism actually predicts. And so it's then a bad inference when they say, well, look, this is a counterexample to theism, so theism is false, right? Or it looks like a counterexample, so we should think theism is false. Okay, so that's the rough idea of what's going on here. There's another layer of complexity, and that is, so Doherty and Proust bring in this idea of just so stories. And also they use the term conciliatory story I mentioned earlier comes from this paper. Or at least that's where I got it from. And so they want to say, well, when you think about how like scientific theories deal with anomalies, typical strategy is to try to come up with a just so story or a conciliatory story about like how perhaps this anomaly can be fitted into the theory. And you can look at defenses and theodicies as doing that for theism, right? So we have these anomalies, and then we want to do our best to try to explain, well, how maybe could this fit within theism, right? And depending on the epistemic status of your conciliatory story, right, the anomaly may be more or less damaging or worrying or whatever, right? Okay, and then one more point here. So you might wonder, like, okay, so is this, what kind of objections might somebody raise to this sort of view? And one of the things that Proust and Doherty note is that, like, you can refute a theory with anomalies. It's just that there either have to be enough anomalies or there have to be bad enough anomalies. And so I think my view is that when it comes to the anomaly defense, the main question at issue is, are the anomalies bad enough or numerous enough to refute theism? And I think it's not implausible that they might be, right? So this is
right.
It's a very serious challenge, right? So anyway, that's, I think, the big question here.
Right. That was my biggest worry for their sort of approach. Like, I grant, like, let's say, like, most evils we could find, like, plausible, justifying goods, or we could tell, at least reasonably plausible stories. And, the ones that we can't, they're like isolated incidents. But it's very different when, I don't know, at least coming from my perspective, it's like, to me, it seems like the default is more like the anomalies. It's like, I don't know, like, this very structure of reality is like hundreds of millions of years of like languishing and death and ripping each other to shreds and like massive starvation and disease and natural disaster and extinction. Like, I look at that and I see like this is a natural state of like misery and scarcity and strife, and we're not just talking mere anomalies to a theory. Like, anyway, that's how I kind of see things.
Yeah, I definitely I feel the force of that. I am maybe a little bit more skeptical about like, are the anomalies bad enough? But I'm certainly not confident. I remember, they do talk about, like, even if you take, for example, like the whole of all the evil in the world and just say this is just way too much, right? That's just one anomaly, they say, right? But it's also a very severe anomaly. So
Right.
I don't know. Anyway, yeah, I definitely hear what you're saying, and I have a good deal of sympathy for it, but I'm maybe a little bit less skeptical than you are on that point.
Yeah, and it's not like I'm like certain in this or anything.
Oh,
It's just
sure.
one of my biggest worries. So yeah, but we can
Yeah,
continue.
absolutely. So that's where all the action is, I think, on this one. Okay, one more epistemic approach, which again is not a kind of skeptical theism, at least not normally considered that, and it doesn't really have a name. I'm just going to call it appealing to counter evidence. And here's what I mean: claiming that evil is evidence against theism, but it's outweighed by evidence for theism. All right, so it's like, look, I don't have to make the skeptical theist claim that like evil isn't even any significant evidence that there's no successful theodicy. Sure, it is, but there's also evidence for theism, and so you've got to weigh the evidence against and the evidence for theism. You weigh it all in the balance, right, and then ask, well, what view comes out on top, right? Does the total evidence favor theism or not, right? And that's not obvious what the answer to that question is, or at least I would say it's not obvious what the answer to that question is. But at any rate, one strategy you can take here is to say, actually, when you weigh up all the evidence, it favors theism, even though evil by itself favors atheism. This is something that William Lane Craig, he has endorsed this strategy. Plantinga does something like this strategy, but he uses reformed epistemology to do it, so it's a little bit different.
So it makes it worse. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah, actually, I agree with that. And then William Rowe, again, back in that famous 1979 paper, he actually talks at the end about, he calls it the Moorean strategy, after G.E. Moore. He says, like, here's something the theist could say. They could be like, yeah, evil is evidence against theism. Oh, right. He wants to say, but the conclusion that theism is false, we have better reason to reject the conclusion than we have to accept all of the premises in the argument from evil that he's developing, right? Rowe does not endorse this move himself. He's just saying this is something the theist could say, right? So you do this kind of like Moorean move where you're like, okay, you got these really plausible premises that lead to a conclusion, but I have better reason to reject the conclusion than to accept both of the premises. And so all things considered, what I should do is reject the conclusion and hold the view that somewhere the argument makes a mistake, whether or not I know where, right? Okay, so Rowe talked about this early on as a possible option for the theist. So one sort of, topic, I guess, related to this to explore is, well, what is the evidence for theism? What forms does it take? Obviously, it could take the form of arguments for theism. I think that arguments for theism, like philosophical arguments for theism, play a pretty big role in my own like epistemic life as someone who at least currently identifies as a theist. But for some people, I think actually probably more commonly, religious experience is really, really epistemically significant. Some people have really powerful religious experiences, and there's a whole literature and debate about like, do religious experiences provide good evidence for related religious claims? I'm inclined to think they do, and that some people, on the basis of religious experience, are very strongly justified in taking a strategy like this in response to the problem of evil. But I am not myself one of those people. I do not personally have a lot of strong religious experiences. But anyway, another possibility that is worth at least noting is religious testimony. So I think especially if you're thinking about like children where all the adults around them teach them that God exists, or relatively isolated religious communities, right? I think religious testimony can be a strong source of justification for certain kinds of religious beliefs. Strong, given that they just don't have a lot of the relevant evidence available to them besides the testimony, I would say.
Right.
So anyway, so that's something. So outstanding issues concerning this topic, just a couple of them here. One, are the theistic arguments, if you're going to take the argument strategy, right, are they strong enough? Obviously, that's a whole other topic all on its own, but it's relevant. And then the gap problem, right? So a lot of the traditional theistic arguments have a version of the so-called gap problem, which is like what they do is they get you as far initially as like some kind of a supernatural creator or something like that, but not necessarily all the way to a being that's all-powerful, all-knowing, and all good. But the argument from evil in its standard forms targets a being that's all-powerful, all-knowing, and all good. So in order to push back against it with theistic arguments, those arguments need to in some way be giving you support. You need a way across that gap, right? The gap from something goddish to, the triple O type God, right? So anyway, another sort of, I think that's actually the main weakness of this approach. There's a lot of interesting work on the gap problem and some, I think, promising strategies for dealing with it. But it's certainly the weakest link, I would say, in this particular move.
Right, and I do just want to say for the audience, I mean, I've said this before for my listeners, but like, yeah, I mean, if I were a theist, this is actually the main response that I'd give to the problem of evil. I'd be like, yes, listen, the total range of facts about evil support atheism or naturalism or something like that over theism. But hey, in the end, it is outweighed by considerations of fine-tuning or psychophysical harmony or certain other things. That would be my approach if I were a theist. And I wouldn't like totally shy away from Theodicies and whatnot, but I would be very adamant on recognizing their limitations. Like they could maybe dent some of the impact of this evidence. Maybe they'll cover some evils. So like we can at least dent some of the evidential impact, but at least for me, this is the approach that I would take as a theist.
Yep. And at least as of now, this is kind of where I'm at with this approach. This is sort of what I say. I want at some point in the maybe not too distant future to take the ideas in my Phil Studies paper on the problem of evil and write a book. And if I were to do that, it would involve, I think, I'd probably be landing on a certain kind of theodicy, if it worked, or if I thought it worked anyway.
Yeah.
And so I do have some like leanings in certain directions in the territory of theodicy, but I would not say that I've got it all worked out in the kind of detail that I eventually would like to have it worked out.
Right. You should do that. That'd be a cool book. I'd encourage you to do that. I would look forward to reading that. Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Okay, one more category, Meta-Theodicy, and I think this one's a little bit shorter. So Meta-Theodicy, again, is just like asking second-order questions about theodicy. So instead of looking at particular theodicies and asking whether they are true or not or whatever, you're asking general questions about like, well, what exactly does a theodicy need to do in order to work, and should we be doing theodicy or not? So we touched on this earlier. Joe gave us his set of constraints on a successful theodicy. I want to talk a little bit more about constraints on successful theodicy. A lot of them can be sorted into these categories. Modal constraints, right? So for example, if you're doing like the greater good approach to theodicy, you might think the greater good in question has got to entail the evil, or at least entail that God permits the evil, or something like that, right? So that's a modal constraint, because otherwise the question is, well, why wouldn't God just make that good without the evil?
Right.
Given that God's omnipotent, if there's no like really tight necessary connection between them, anyway. So this constraint I alluded to earlier is maybe a little bit controversial, though something like it has got to be right. So I think Eleanor Stump, I think, for example, says something like, well, what you need is for there to be no better way. to bring about that good, but not necessarily for there to be no other way at all. And so that might call for a slightly more nuanced version of this constraint. I think Swinburne says something similar, actually, because open theism kind of messes with this a little bit too. But at any rate, something like this is very plausible. Axiological constraints. So these are constraints on value. So for example, perhaps if you're doing the greater good thing, the good has got to outweigh the evil, right? So again, this was one of Joe's constraints. So, some people also endorse more specific axiological constraints, like the good has to be a good for the victim. It's Eleanor Stump, for example, endorses a constraint along these lines, right? Like the suffering has to be for the good of the victim, and not just for some like generic worldly good or the good of somebody else. Marilyn Adams endorses a constraint that says that the evils, horrendous evils at any rate, have to be defeated. And she's getting this notion of defeat from Chisholm, if I remember correctly. And the idea is something like this. An evil is defeated if it gets incorporated into a good that is an organic unity. And that's a term that comes from G.E. Moore. But the idea is that the overall value of the good is not just the difference between the value of the goods and evils you combined to make it. But anyway, I don't want to get into all the details there. But so the point is, Adams thinks you want your theodicy to have the result that God is good to us. And she also thinks that for God to be good to us, it has to be the case that God defeats any horrors that we are victims of. So an axiological constraint of sorts. Similarly, there's not a whole lot of discussion of this, but you might wonder, like, does God need to compensate sufferers for their suffering? Some people have talked about this, but it's not a big topic. So these are all at least broadly axiological constraints. Now, I want to say something about that first one. Does the good need to outweigh the evil? Because as Joe and I discussed earlier, this one is a little bit controversial, only because not all theodicies are greater good theodicies, right? So some theodicies say that that morality includes what Scheffler calls agent-centered prerogatives, where this is like a prerogative to do less than the best you can do, even though it's permissible to do the best. And so things like that, if morality has prerogatives like that, then it's at least not obvious that there always has to be an outweighing good. Similarly, if you think that Mark Murphy, I blanked on his name for a second. Mark Murphy has this view that says that God only has justifying reasons and not requiring reasons to promote human well-being, or actually any creaturely well-being. And so if that's the case, then it's not clear that God needs a greater good in order to justify just letting suffering take place. There just need to be other goods that God has justifying reasons to pursue instead. Or perhaps sufficiently strong justifying reasons. But even if that's the case, it's not clear that that means the good in question has to outweigh the suffering. At least it's not clear to me that that's true on his view. And then there are, of course, also views on which God is basically transcendent of morality in a fairly radical way, where God is just not bound by moral constraints at all, nor does God necessarily even act in accordance with them. And so in that case, even if you think morality requires there's got to be an outweighing good, it doesn't follow that theodicy requires that. So for reasons like those, this is a controversial constraint. Nevertheless, it is a constraint that many theodicies are at least attempting to satisfy. Just flagging, this is a common but controversial constraint. Okay, another type of constraint, deontic constraints. This is perhaps the most badly ignored set of constraints in the whole project of theodicy, right? Lots of people talking about greater goods that necessitate permitting various evils. Fewer people paying any attention to whether there might be side constraints, as they're called, on promoting good. Situations where there's a duty not to bring about a greater good. And so there are a number of different potential side constraints, right? Like this is the sort of thing, like if you're a consequentialist, you don't think there are any constraints like this. But if you're not a consequentialist, and I'm definitely not a consequentialist, you might think, for example, that there are side constraints on intending evil as opposed to merely foreseeing it, or on doing it as opposed to merely allowing it, or constraints involving consent, right? So there are some things you can do to another person if they consent to it, but not if they don't, right? And so the issue there, at least on the face of it, doesn't seem to be a question of, is it worth doing? Does the value, the positive value, outweigh the negative value? It's, do you have permission? And then I think I mentioned this earlier, but I actually think that there are probably some pretty robust constraints, even setting aside consent type issues, on permitting horrendous evils, side constraints on permitting horrendous evils. Like, I don't think that if I saw somebody torturing a child, that I should allow that to continue because I know somehow that the child, it's going to lead to like soul building for that child later in their life. It seems to me, nope, I need to intervene.
Right. Yeah.
So
Also seems right to me.
Okay, I'm not alone. That's good. All right.
One quick thing, wait, for the audience, I don't think we defined what side constraints are or what like deontic constraints are. So no, it's fine. So if you want to just define that for the audience.
So I'm using side constraint, deontic constraint, those basically interchangeably. But so the idea is that if you're not a consequentialist, you think that there are some moral restrictions against promoting value, meaning there are some situations in which, or ways in which, it is not okay to bring about a greater good, is roughly what that means. So even if there are cases where, like, if you allowed this suffering to happen, it would lead to a greater good, it doesn't automatically follow that you can therefore allow it to happen, because there may be a rule that says, nope, you can't allow that unless the victim consents, or something like that, right? Or you can allow it, but you can't intend it or do it yourself, or, stuff like that, right?
Okay. Yeah, they're basically like restrictions on the permissible ways of promoting good.
Yep. Perfect. Okay, so we're getting near the end here. So one big topic, this is sort of like a subtopic of like, what are the constraints on a successful theodicy? But it's one that's kind of blossomed into a whole literature on its own, is gratuitous evil compatible with theism? There's a big debate about this. Different things can be meant by gratuitous evil, but minimally, to be gratuitous, an evil has to be such that it isn't outweighed by any greater good. That's like a minimal notion of gratuity. And so there's a question, all right, is this compatible with theism? Well, some people say yes. The standard view is, or at least I would say at this point, it's still the standard view, but there's been a lot of pushback lately. It may not remain the standard view much longer. But the standard view is no. Gratuitous evil is not compatible with theism, because a perfectly good God would not permit suffering for no reason, right? God would have to have some reason for allowing this to happen, right? Probably the most famous sort of pushback against the standard view is Van Inwagen. Peter Van Inwagen has said, well, wait a second. Suppose that the purposes God has for the universe are vague. And he actually has a specific theory about what it is God's trying to do with the evil in the world. But his thought is there may be no like definite amount of evil that is sufficient for God's purposes, right? It may be that if God picks some amount of evil that is sufficient for God's purposes, it will inevitably be the case that a little bit less evil would have been sufficient as well, because there's no like sharp line that says, okay, at this point, there's enough evil now. So Van Inwagen tries to use this to defend the compatibility of gratuitous evil and theism, because it means that God has to allow at least some evil that didn't have to be there. That's the thought. This has been very influential. Lots of people have talked about this. Lots of people have responded to him and critiqued what he said. Some people defend it. By far, kind of like the main sort of defense of gratuitous evil out there. Another one that's interesting and somewhat influential is Hasker's view. And Hasker, I think I mentioned earlier, he basically says, look, if there were no gratuitous evil, it would undermine moral motivation, because we would be like, well, look, anytime somebody suffers, it's for the good, right? Or God's got some good reason for this. So we wouldn't be then off trying to prevent suffering and so forth. So anyway, that's Hasker, at least the core of Hasker's move. And then there are others as well who have defended, in some sense or other, the compatibility of gratuitous evil with theism. And so I've listed a few there. Another topic that is, again, like sort of a subtopic under that, like what constraints does a theodicy need to satisfy? This one I think is really important and has not been discussed enough. There has been discussion of it. There should be more. Should theodicy be sufferer-centered? So this is Dustin Crumit's terminology. A sufferer-centered theodicy is these are theodicies which claim, at least roughly, that suffering is for the benefit of the victim, or that it's always defeated in the life of the victim, right? So Stump says something like the first thing, Adams says something like the second thing, and there are other people who like theodicies along these lines as well. Here's the worry, right? So a bunch of people, at least some people are worried about these kinds of theodicies because they threaten ordinary morality, right? So here are the outstanding issues here. Do these theodicies clash with ordinary morality? A bunch of people have suggested that they do. And the thought is like, look, if suffering is always good for the victim, then we shouldn't be trying to prevent suffering, and maybe we should even be trying to cause it. Dustin's paper on this, Dustin Crumit, I think his paper on this is probably the best thing that's ever been written on this topic so far.
As is typical of Dustin.
Yeah. And it's really nice. Like, he goes through some of the most prominent, like, moral theories and explains, like, the way in which they presuppose, at least on their most plausible interpretations, presuppose that sufferer-centered theodicies are false. Or at least that, this consequence of sufferer-centered theodicies is false, that suffering is always like a net positive or something like that. Anyway, so that's one issue. And then a related issue, which Dustin also talks about, is it morally bad to affirm these sorts of theodicies? So this is kind of similar to the victim blaming stuff, but it's not quite the same. Some people are, like, I think rightly, pretty uncomfortable with the suggestion that, like, you could, tell people who have suffered horrendously, hey, this was actually for your good. That just doesn't seem appropriate, at least in a lot of contexts. Maybe a little bit more of a difficult question whether the context of academic theodicy is, if it's inappropriate there. I don't know. But anyway, that's another outstanding issue here. Okay, now I'm really almost done. So just really quickly, some other topics in meta-theodicy that I'm not going to say a lot about, but I want to mention. God and morality. Is God beyond morality in some sense? We've mentioned this a couple of times, so I won't say anything else, but I've listed there some people who say, yes, in some sense or other, God is beyond morality. Providence, we actually touched on this a little bit too, but there's some literature on this question of, like, what difference does it make whether, what view we take of how God controls the world, in what way God is provident over the world, right? Do some models of providence make the problem of evil easier to solve, harder to solve, and so on, right? And so this is like where questions like, does open theism help? Does Molinism help? Those kinds of questions come up here. Does theological determinism make it worse? Does Molinism make it worse, etc.? And then anti-theodicy. So there's a whole body of literature on this question of, is the whole project of theodicy immoral? Like, is it immoral to try to justify, in some sense, the horrendous evils in the world? And when you put it that way, it sounds like obviously, but maybe a better way to put it is it immoral to try to argue that God is in some sense justified in permitting those evils? And I think it's less obvious that that's immoral, but again, huge issue. Lots of stuff written about it. Okay, there you go. That was an overview of the analytic philosophical literature on the problem of evil. Not exhaustive, but I think it gives a pretty good picture of some of the main things that people are talking about.
It gives an excellent picture. So thank you so much, Justin, for putting that together. I know you got recommended resources that we're going to get through. But I just wanted to reiterate again, thank you for putting that together. And our audience should also, again, type thank you, Justin, down there in the comments section.
Okay. Yeah, great. Thanks. I'm glad that it worked. So I did put a few resources here. So books, if you want an introductory book, Daniel Speak's book, The Problem of Evil, is one place you could look. I mean, there's so much, like, I could point to any number of things, but so these are just a few, recommended places. A book that's not so much introductory, but is a great resource for like reading something about like almost any topic within the umbrella of the problem of evil. The Blackwell Companion to the Problem of Evil covers a lot of ground, and it's just a collection of essays by different people. And it's trying to be like relatively representative of like all the different subtopics in the problem of evil. So that's a good source. Reference sources. Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is always a great source, though it can be sort of technical. And there is an entry on the problem of evil. Unless it's changed recently, I believe it's by Michael Tooley. There's also an entry on skeptical theism, last I checked, so that could be useful as well. My bibliography of work on the problem of evil, which we've already mentioned. And then videos, I recommend The Analytic Christian, another channel. I don't know if this is like a, maybe I shouldn't be recommending other channels while I'm...
No, that's totally fine. I always recommend, dude, I recommend Jordan's channel all the time, as dedicated viewers know. So everyone, check out The Analytic Christian. It's an amazing channel. I listen to it regularly. I really enjoy it.
Yeah, and so he does have a playlist of videos on the problem of evil, and I think at least a while ago he said something like, I think it's his longest playlist. So there's a lot of videos there on the problem of evil, and I think that his content is generally extremely good. So that's another resource I recommend.
Okay, Justin, thank you so much for the presentation. I hope the audience got a lot out of it. I know I did, and I know a lot of my friends will. So do you have any concluding comments before I do my little ending spiel?
Oh, sure. I mean, maybe I'll just say this. Obviously, this is a complicated and vast issue. And so I mean, maybe I'll leave with one sort of suggestion or exhortation for the audience, which is just like, do not treat this topic flippantly. Take your time with it. Be very careful, and don't be overconfident.
I think that's a good exhortation, and it's a good exhortation in philosophy. Very
Yes,
often we
fair
fail to recognize that for any given topic, which is hotly debated in philosophy, like there are many, many, many experts on that particular topic who wrote their dissertation on it and who could own oneself in a debate on that topic, and who has who's thought of the relevant objections that you could pose to them, who has responded to them extensively, maybe even in print, who has is aware of more arguments about the topic than you, who is aware of more objections and considerations. It's just a call to epistemic humility. So I do like ending videos in a call to epistemic humility because all this stuff is immensely, immensely difficult. Especially, I think it's worth being humble when it relates to very, very deep and difficult practical issues. Like a lot of us are suffering in very bad ways. So it's a sad way to end. But again, thanks, Justin, for the wonderful presentation. And I know I got so much out of it, and so my audience will as well. For everyone, check out links in the description to Justin's amazing work. He's got a lot of work on the problem of evil that you should all immediately read. I've linked in the description his bibliography and various other papers and books that we've mentioned. And of course, then, what better way to end is there than I'm Joe Schmid. This is The Majesty of Reason, and peace out.